Every empire has a throat. Blackmere Keep was Valadorn's, and the man who held the blade against it never once needed to cut. Duke Caedric Draven ruled the northern provinces the way a winter storm rules the sky, not by asking permission, but by making everything beneath it small. Generals who had survived 3 border wars still lowered their voices when his name surfaced at council tables. Noble sons learned his reputation before they learned to ride. And somewhere inside that obsidian fortress carved into the coastal cliffs, a man who had mastered the art of being feared sat alone in the dark and could not sleep. Because fear, as it turned out, was a kingdom with no heir. It consumed everything it touched and left nothing worth inheriting. The fire had gone cold 2 hours ago. Caedric sat in the high-backed chair beside the dead hearth, still dressed in the black formal coat he had worn to the evening's trade summit, his boots planted on stone older than the dynasty that bore his name. Blackmere's private study was a room designed for intimidation even when empty. Iron candelabras bolted to walls of dark granite, shelves lined with ledgers containing debts owed by half the noble families in the kingdom. A single arched window overlooking the northern sea, where winter fog crawled across the water like something wounded trying to reach shore. He had not moved in over an hour. On the desk in front of him lay a letter bearing the royal seal of House Ashworth, the crown's administrative arm. 3 sentences. Formal. Devastating in their restraint. The winter court gathering would proceed as scheduled. All northern lords were expected to attend. And Lady Seraphina Vale had formally requested reinstatement to aristocratic society under the patronage of the Marchioness of Dunhaven. Caedric read the name again. Seraphina Vale. He closed his eyes. Not from fatigue. From the specific kind of fury that only surfaces when a man who has spent years building walls discovers someone has kept a key he never knew existed. 7 years. 7 years since she had stood in his father's banquet hall, barely 19, wearing a gown the color of crushed berries, and looked at him without the performative terror every other person in the room wore like formal dress. 7 years since she had spoken to him as though he were merely human, which at the time had felt more insulting than any challenge a rival lord had ever issued. 7 years since the old duke had noticed his son watching her across the room and delivered the only piece of advice the man ever gave that wasn't laced with political calculation. Forget her. She's promised to Varen of the South, and you don't have the architecture for that kind of weakness. His father had been right about everything except the forgetting. Caedric opened his eyes and stared at the letter. Then he folded it once, precisely, and fed it to the nearest candle flame. The paper curled and blackened and died. The name remained. The door opened without a knock, which meant it was either an assassin or Hadric Voss, his chief advisor. Since Hadric was still alive after 20 years of entering rooms unannounced, the distinction had become academic. You're still awake. Hadric crossed the study with the unhurried gait of a man who had survived proximity to 3 generations of Dravens, 60 years old, silver-haired, built like a diplomat who had once been a soldier and never fully abandoned either profession. He set a fresh decanter of whiskey on the desk and sat in the only other chair the room contained. The Ashworth letter. Burned. I assumed I have a copy. Of course you do. Hadric poured 2 glasses. He pushed one toward the Duke and kept the other. The court is going to treat her arrival like blood in the water. You understand that? Caedric didn't answer. He picked up the glass and held it without drinking. The Marchioness of Dunhaven is a sentimental old woman with more influence than judgment, Hadric continued. She's providing patronage because Seraphina's mother was her childhood companion. It's loyalty, not strategy. Which means Seraphina will arrive at Winter Court with exactly 1 political ally and no protection worth mentioning. She survived a broken engagement with Lord Varen. She survived a year of exile. She doesn't strike me as someone who requires rescue. She doesn't require rescue. She requires someone to not actively destroy her, which, given the current political climate, is a higher bar than you'd think. Hadric drank. Lord Malgrim has already started circulating rumors. Claims she broke the engagement because she was carrying another man's child. Claims the year she vanished was spent in a convent disposing of the evidence. Caedric's jaw tightened. A small movement, nearly invisible. But Hadric had spent 2 decades reading the man's silences the way other advisors read dispatches. It's not true, Hadric said quietly. I didn't ask. You didn't have to, Your knuckles just turned white." Caedric set the glass down. He stood and walked to the window. The fog had thickened. Blackmere's outer walls were barely visible, their torches reduced to faint orange wounds in the gray. "What do you actually want me to do about this, Caedric?" "Nothing. That's precisely my recommendation. Let her arrive. Let the court do what the court does. Stay uninvolved. You have a treaty negotiation with the Eastern Marches in 3 weeks, and a taxation dispute with House Caldern that's 2 insults away from armed conflict. You cannot afford emotional entanglement." "I don't get emotionally entangled." Caedric almost smiled. Almost. "My lord, you burned a letter 30 seconds after reading it. Men who feel nothing use letters for kindling out of efficiency, not fury." Silence filled the room, like temperature dropping. "She'll arrive in 6 days," Caedric said, standing. "Whatever you're planning to do, decide before she walks through those doors. Because once the court sees your reaction, they'll weaponize it before she's finished her first curtsy." He left the glass half full on the desk and exited the study without waiting for dismissal. The door closed softly behind him. The sound was worse than a slam. It was the sound of someone who knew you better than you'd ever authorized. Caedric remained at the window. 6 days. He had conquered provinces in less time, restructured noble hierarchies over a single dinner, broken men who thought themselves unbreakable with nothing more than patience and the willingness to wait longer than anyone believed possible. But standing in the dark of his own study, he understood something he would never admit aloud. Seraphina Vale was not a province. She was not a political obstacle. She was not a problem that yielded to pressure or strategy or force. She was the only person who had ever made him feel like the walls he had built around himself were not fortifications, but a cage. And she was coming back. The winter court descended on Blackmere like a beautiful disease. 300 nobles arrived over 4 days, filling the castle's guest wings with silk luggage, personal servants, and enough political ambition to fuel a small war. The great hall was transformed. Iron chandeliers hung with crystalline ornaments, long tables draped in Draven black and silver, enough food and wine to remind every visiting lord exactly how wealthy Blackmere's coffers remained. Caedric hosted the opening ceremonies with the mechanical precision of a man performing a role he had memorized rather than inhabited. He greeted each lord with calibrated respect. He acknowledged each lady with a politeness so measured it bordered on dismissal. He gave a welcome address that lasted exactly 4 minutes and contained not a single word anyone could later quote as warmth. The court loved it. They always did. There was a perverse comfort in Caedric's coldness. It was predictable. Predictable rulers were survivable rulers, and surviving was the aristocracy's oldest skill. On the 5th night, Seraphina arrived. She came without announcement, no herald, no entourage beyond a single attendant and the Marchioness of Dunhaven, who walked beside her with the protective posture of someone escorting a niece into hostile territory. The great hall was mid-reception, 200 nobles scattered across the floor in clusters of conversation and competitive elegance. When the doors opened and she stepped through. Silver morning silk, hair pulled back from her face in a style that was either deliberate simplicity or defiance against the elaborate fashions surrounding her. No jewelry except a thin chain at her throat bearing a pendant too small to identify from a distance. She moved through the doorway the way someone enters a room they have already decided not to flee from, regardless of what waits inside. Conversations didn't stop. They fractured. Words trailed into silence table by table, group by group, like a wave of quiet spreading outward from the door. 200 aristocrats turned their attention toward the woman the entire kingdom had been whispering about for a year. The ones who hated her assessed weakness. The ones who pitied her assessed damage. The ones who feared what her return meant assessed the nearest exit. Caedric was standing beside the eastern fireplace with a delegation from House Caldern when the shift occurred. He didn't turn immediately. He felt it first, the room changing frequency, the way air pressure drops before a storm touches land. Then Lord Caldern's gaze drifted past Caedric's shoulder and stayed there, and the old man's expression cycled through recognition, surprise, and something uncomfortably close to hunger. Caedric turned. The distance between them was perhaps 40 feet, might as well have been nothing. Seraphina's gaze moved across the room with unhurried composure, cataloging faces, measuring threats, reading the terrain, The way a woman who had survived social exile learned to read any room she entered. Her eyes found him. Held. She did not look away. She did not curtsy. She did not perform a single gesture of deference, fear, or submission. She simply looked at him the way she had looked at him 7 years ago, as though the title, the power, the reputation, and the fortress made of black stone were all very interesting but ultimately irrelevant to whatever she actually saw when she met his eyes. Caedric felt something shift inside his chest. Not warmth, something more dangerous. Recognition. The specific, devastating sensation of being seen by someone who had no use for the version of himself he showed the world. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to Lord Caldern and resumed the conversation about grain tariffs as though nothing had happened. But his pulse was wrong, and he knew it. And across the room, he suspected she knew it too. The banquet that followed was a masterwork of aristocratic cruelty. Serafina was seated at a peripheral table, far from the high dais where Caedric presided. A deliberate insult arranged by the court's social architects, designed to remind her exactly where a disgraced woman belonged in the hierarchy. She accepted the placement without visible reaction, which infuriated the people who had arranged it more than any protest could have. The first hour passed with the performative civility the court did best. Wine flowed. Toasts were raised. Ministers delivered flattering remarks about the Duke's stewardship of the northern provinces. Music played from the gallery above, strings and woodwinds weaving through conversations that meant nothing and cost everything. Then Lord Everett Malgrim stood up. Malgrim was the kind of man who had inherited power the way some people inherit disease. It was in his blood, and it was slowly rotting him from the inside out. Tall, angular, handsome in the way sharp objects were handsome, all edges and no warmth. He controlled 3 eastern provinces through a combination of debt manipulation and strategic marriage, and he had spent the last decade positioning himself as the voice of the old aristocracy against what he privately called Draven overreach. He raised his glass. The hall quieted. When a man of Malgrim's standing requested attention, even the servants stopped moving. "A toast," he said, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of someone who had rehearsed casual cruelty until it sounded effortless. "To the return of Lady Serafina Vale. It takes remarkable courage to re-enter society after such extensive absence. We can only hope the circumstances that drove her departure have been resolved." He paused. Let the silence do its work. 200 nobles heard exactly what he meant, and not one of them missed the implication buried beneath the courtesy. "To resilience," Malgrim finished, and drank. Laughter rippled through the hall. Not loud, not overt. The kind of quiet, knowing amusement that was worse than open mockery because it wore the mask of sophistication. Serafina's expression didn't change. She lifted her own glass and drank without acknowledging the toast. Steady hands, steady eyes. Whatever the insult cost her, she buried it deep enough that the room couldn't feed on it. But Caedric saw it. From the elevated dais 50 feet away, he saw the almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of her mouth, the slight shift in her breathing, the way her free hand pressed flat against the table surface, not in weakness, but in the deliberate, controlled gesture of someone channeling fury into stillness, because the alternative was a response she couldn't afford. He saw it because he recognized it. He had performed the same transformation 1,000 times, converting pain into stone, emotion into discipline, vulnerability into something the world could not reach. The hall was still absorbing Malgrim's toast when Caedric raised one hand. That was all. One hand, lifted from the armrest of his chair approximately 6 inches. Every voice in the room died. The musicians stopped mid-phrase. Servants froze against the walls. 200 nobles turned toward the dais with the collective instinct of animals registering a predator's attention. Caedric did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Malgrim across the length of the great hall with an expression that contained no anger, no threat, and absolutely no mercy. "Lord Malgrim." His voice was quiet, almost conversational. It carried to every corner of the hall because absolute silence has no competition. "When you speak in my hall, you speak under my hospitality, and hospitality at Blackmere has never included the entertainment of cowardice disguised as courtesy." The temperature in the room dropped. Not physically, socially. Every noble present felt the same instinctive tightening in their gut. The recognition that the most dangerous man in the kingdom had just drawn a line, and someone was standing on the wrong side of it. Malgrim's smile held, but something behind his eyes shifted, calculation replacing confidence. Your Grace, I intended no disrespect, merely a welcome. You intended precisely what you delivered. The difference between us is that I don't require euphemism. Caedric's hand returned to the armrest. Sit down, eat, and consider whether your next attempt at wit is worth the price of my attention. Malgrim sat. The hall resumed breathing. Conversations restarted with the brittle energy of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed something that would reshape the court's internal politics for months. Musicians played, wine poured. The machinery of social performance cranked back into motion. But the damage was done. Not to Malgrim, though the humiliation would fester and compound in ways that would prove catastrophic later. The damage was to the court's understanding of Caedric Draven. For 15 years, the Duke had governed through impersonal authority, power applied to systems, structures, institutions, cold, mechanical, predictable. This was different, this was personal, and every political mind in the room recognized the distinction instantly. The Duke had just publicly defended a disgraced woman he had no strategic reason to protect. The aristocracy didn't know what to do with that information yet. But they would learn, and the education would cost all of them dearly. Later that night, long after the banquet ended and the castle settled into the restless quiet of 300 guests sleeping behind locked doors, Caedric found Seraphina in the corridor outside the East Wing library. She was standing before a tall window, looking out at the frozen coastline. The moonlight through the glass turned the silver silk of her dress into something almost liquid. She heard his footsteps and turned, and for a moment they simply occupied the same corridor without pretense, without audience, without the elaborate performance the court demanded of every interaction. You didn't need to do that, she said. Do what? Intervene. I've survived worse than ever at Malgrim's dinner theater. Caedric stopped 3 paces from her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to maintain the fiction that this was coincidence rather than intention. I didn't intervene for your benefit. No? Malgrim was being tedious. I have limited tolerance for tedium in my own hall. Seraphina studied him. That same direct, unarmored gaze that had unsettled him 7 years ago, and unsettled him now for entirely different reasons. You're a terrible liar for someone with your reputation. I'm an excellent liar, which is why you should be concerned that I'm choosing not to be one right now. The faintest suggestion of a smile touched her mouth. Not warm, not grateful, something sharper. The court thinks you're staking a claim. You realize that. The court thinks whatever confirms their existing fears. It's their most reliable quality. And what should I think? He looked at her. The moonlight carved shadows beneath her cheekbones and turned her eyes into something darker than their natural color. She was thinner than he remembered, not fragile, compressed, as though the year of exile had burned away everything non-essential and left only the core structure beneath. You should think, he said slowly, that Blackmere is the safest place in this kingdom for someone the aristocracy wants destroyed, and that safety has a cost. Everything in your world has a cost. You can't help it. You price things the way other people breathe, and you see through people the way other people make conversation. We're both afflicted. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between two people who understand each other well enough to find words temporarily unnecessary. Why did you come back? He asked. The question was quieter than anything he'd said all evening, stripped of authority, almost human. Seraphina turned back to the window. The frozen sea stretched toward the horizon, white and vast and indifferent. Because hiding is just another form of obedience, she said, and I got tired of obeying a world that had already decided I was guilty. Guilty of what? She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Pain, maybe, or the memory of pain, or the refusal to let either one surface in the presence of another human being. Does it matter? The court doesn't need facts to convict someone. They just need consensus. It matters to me. Why? He didn't answer, because the honest answer was something he didn't yet have vocabulary for, and Caedric Draven did not speak in approximations. Seraphina waited. When the silence stretched long enough to become its own answer, she nodded once, not in disappointment, but in recognition, as though she had expected exactly this and found the confirmation neither comforting nor surprising. Good night, Your Grace. She walked past him down the corridor. The silver silk caught the torchlight, and then she was gone around the corner, and Caedric stood alone in the empty hallway with the specific, brutal understanding that he had just failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. He pressed one hand flat against the cold stone wall. Control, discipline. The architecture of emotional suppression that had kept him functional for 34 years. None of it was designed for this. The days that followed transformed Blackmere into a pressure vessel. The court watched Caedric's behavior with the obsessive attention of scientists observing an unstable element. Every glance he directed towards Seraphina was catalogued. Every conversation they shared, however brief, however public, was dissected and redistributed through the castle's gossip networks within hours. And Caedric, despite every instinct telling him to maintain distance, kept finding reasons to close it. He assigned Seraphina a seat at the secondary council table during morning briefings, citing protocol regarding the Marchioness of Dunhaven's patronage. He approved her access to Blackmere's private library, a privilege normally reserved for direct vassals. He arranged for her quarters to be relocated from the peripheral guest wing to the east corridor, closer to the castle's secured interior, closer to him. Each decision was defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern so obvious that even the least politically astute noble in attendance could read it. Caedric confronted him after the fourth day. They were in the war room, a windowless chamber beneath the keep where military strategy was planned and political catastrophes were managed. Maps covered every surface. Iron markers representing troop positions dotted the northern border. The room smelled like old parchment and cold metal. "You need to stop," Caedric said without preamble. Caedric was reviewing dispatches from the eastern marches. He didn't look up. "Specify." "You know exactly what I'm specifying. The library access, the seating changes, the quarters relocation. You're building a perimeter around her, Caedric, and the entire court is watching you do it." "The court watches everything I do. It's never affected my decisions before." "Because your decisions before were strategic. This isn't strategy. This is something you haven't done in your entire life, and frankly, it's terrifying people who depend on your predictability to keep this kingdom from collapsing." Caedric set the dispatch down. He looked at Caedric with the flat, measuring expression that made lesser men reconsider their career choices. "Are you finished?" "Not remotely." Caedric pulled a chair from the table and sat without being invited. "Malgrim is building a coalition. 3 southern houses have already committed. House Caldern is wavering, which means they're waiting to see which side offers better terms before they betray one of us. And the whispers have shifted. They're no longer saying you've taken a personal interest in the Veil woman. They're saying she's compromised you." Compromised. Their word, not mine. The implication being that whatever hold she has over you is powerful enough to override your judgment, which makes you vulnerable, which makes the duchy vulnerable, which gives every ambitious lord in the kingdom a reason to test boundaries they've been too frightened to approach for 15 years. Silence. Caedric leaned back in his chair. The iron markers on the map between them glinted in the lamplight like tiny weapons waiting to be deployed. "You think I should send her away? I think you should decide what she's worth, because the cost of keeping her here is climbing by the hour, and you are the only person in this castle who doesn't seem to realize that." "I realize it." "Then act like it." Caedric stood. He walked to the map table and placed one finger on the marker representing Blackmere Keep. A small iron wolf, his family's sigil, surrounded by markers representing allies, enemies, and the vast gray territory of houses that could become either depending on which way the wind carried ambition. "My father once told me that a ruler's most dangerous weakness is anything he cannot walk away from. That every possession, every alliance, every attachment is only as valuable as your willingness to sacrifice it when the situation demands. Your father was a brilliant strategist. My father died alone in a room full of advisors who were already dividing his territory before his body was cold. Brilliant strategy doesn't keep you warm, Caedric." The advisor said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't either confirm the Duke's point or expose his own. Caedric removed his finger from the map. The iron wolf stood alone on the table, surrounded by potential enemies. "She stays." Caedric closed his eyes briefly. The expression of a man watching an avalanche begin and understanding that he was standing at the bottom of the mountain. "Then we prepare for war." "We're always prepared for war. That's the only thing my father taught me that was worth inheriting." On the 9th night of Winter Court, Seraphina found him. Not in the corridors, not in the public spaces where the court could observe and interpret. She came to the private terrace above the north wall, a narrow stone ledge overlooking the frozen sea where Caedric went when the castle's political atmosphere became suffocating. It was the one place in Blackmere where no one followed him, because the wind was brutal enough to discourage anyone without a reason strong enough to endure it. She appeared in the doorway wrapped in a heavy cloak, her hair loose against the wind, and she didn't wait for permission to approach. "You're avoiding me," she said. "I'm avoiding everyone. You're not special in that regard." "Yes, I am. You avoided everyone before I arrived too, but now you're avoiding me specifically, which requires more effort, which means I occupy more of your attention than your schedule suggests." He almost smiled, caught it, killed it. "You've been spending time in my library, developing your skills in argumentation?" "I've been spending time in your library because it's the only room in this castle where people don't stare at me like I'm either a weapon or a victim." She moved to the parapet and looked out at the sea. The wind pulled at her cloak. She didn't flinch. "Your court hates me, Caedric." It was the first time she had used his name without the title. The sound of it in her voice did something to the architecture of his composure that he was not prepared for. "My court hates anything it can't control or categorize." "They can categorize me just fine. Disgraced, dangerous. The woman the Duke protects for reasons no one can explain, which makes her either a political asset they haven't identified or a vulnerability they're already planning to exploit." "And which are you?" She turned to face him. The wind died for a moment, as though even the weather understood the significance of what was about to be said. "Neither. I'm a woman who broke an engagement to a man who hit me behind closed doors and smiled about it in public. I'm a woman who disappeared for a year because the alternative was letting the aristocracy watch me fall apart for their entertainment. And I'm a woman who came back because I decided that surviving isn't the same thing as living, and I was done accepting the difference." The words landed in the cold air between them with the weight of something that had been carried alone for far too long. Caedric looked at her, not at the silver silk or the windswept hair or the sharp intelligence in her expression, at the damage underneath, the kind of damage he recognized because it mirrored his own, the specific wound left by people who were supposed to protect you choosing instead to consume you. "Varen," he said quietly, the name of her former fiancé. "Don't say his name like you're planning something." "I'm always planning something. That's what frightens me about you. Not the reputation, not the power. The fact that your first response to someone else's pain is strategy." The observation cut deeper than she probably intended, or maybe exactly as deep as she intended. Seraphina did not strike him as a woman who miscalculated the weight of her own words. "What would you prefer?" he asked. "Honesty. Just once. Without the calculation, without the positioning. Tell me why you're protecting me. The real reason. Not the political justification you've been feeding Caedric." The wind returned. It screamed across the parapet and pulled at their clothing and filled the silence that followed her demand with the sound of something vast and indifferent and permanent. Caedric looked at her. He thought about his father's advice. He thought about Haedric's warning. He thought about 15 years of governance built on the principle that vulnerability was the only currency a ruler could not afford to spend. "Because you looked at me," he said, 7 years ago, in my father's hall. Every person in that room looked at the title, the name, the power. You looked at me, and no one has done that since." The confession hung in the air between them, raw, unstrategic, possibly the most dangerous sentence he had ever spoken, because it contained no angle, no leverage, no escape route. Just truth, standing naked in the wind like something that had never been allowed outside before. Seraphina's expression shifted, not into softness, into something more complicated. Pain and recognition and the terrible understanding that the most powerful man in the kingdom had just handed her a weapon she never asked for and would never use, and that the act of giving it was itself a form of surrender he had never offered anyone else. She stepped closer. Close enough that the wind couldn't fit between them. She reached up and placed one hand against his jaw. Her fingers were cold from the wind. He felt every single one of them. "That," she said quietly, "is the most terrifying thing anyone has ever said to me." "Good. Now we're even." They stood that way for a long time, two people on the edge of something neither could name yet, balanced on a wall above a frozen sea, while somewhere inside the castle below them, The machinery of conspiracy continued to turn. Caedric didn't kiss her, not because he didn't want to, because he understood, with the survival instinct that had kept him alive through betrayals and assassination attempts and the slow poison of political isolation, that the moment he crossed that line, there would be no returning to the man he was before. And he was not yet certain that the man on the other side was someone who could survive what was coming. 3 days later, the trap closed. A royal courier arrived at Blackmere before dawn, bearing sealed documents from the Crown Council. Caedric was summoned from sleep. Caedric's voice through the door, clipped and urgent in a way that the advisor reserved for genuine emergencies rather than political theater. The war room. Lamplight. Caedric standing beside the table with an expression Caedric had seen exactly twice in 2 decades of partnership. Both previous occasions had preceded events that resulted in dead men and redrawn borders. "Read them," Caedric said, and placed the documents on the table. Caedric read. Forged letters bearing Seraphina's signature. Correspondence with Lord Varen's military advisors discussing Blackmere's defensive weaknesses. Strategic notes referencing troop positions that only someone with access to the Duchy's private intelligence would possess. Dates aligning perfectly with her arrival at Winter Court. Seals authenticated by 3 independent witnesses. The evidence was immaculate, seamless, the kind of fabrication that required months of preparation, access to royal archival materials, and the cooperation of at least 4 noble houses working in concert. At the bottom of the final page, a formal accusation signed by Lord Malgrim and countersigned by the heads of houses Caldern, Ashworth, and Montague. Treason. The accusation carried a mandatory sentence of execution. Caedric set the documents down. His hands were perfectly steady. His pulse was not. "When does the council convene?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning. They've already dispatched guards to place her under protective custody." Caedric's voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a man delivering information while simultaneously bracing for the response. "The council will expect you to comply. Tradition requires—" "I know what tradition requires." "Then you know that refusing to surrender her is—" "I know what it is." Silence. The lamplight flickered across the forged documents. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was bleeding through Blackmere's walls, and somewhere in the east corridor, Seraphina was sleeping behind a door that would not protect her from what was coming. Caedric looked at the iron wolf on the map table. Alone, surrounded. "Get me my sword," he said. And Caedric, who had served 3 Dravens and survived them all, heard something in those 4 words that made him realize the man standing before him was no longer operating within any framework of political logic he recognized. The Duke of Blackmere was about to burn down everything he had built, and he was going to do it with his eyes open. The sword arrived before the sun cleared the horizon. Caedric placed it on the war room table without ceremony. A Draven ancestral blade, black-hilted, the steel carrying a faint bluish tint from generations of careful maintenance. It was not a ceremonial weapon. It was the blade Caedric's grandfather had used to execute 3 traitors on the steps of the Crown Council 60 years ago. The kind of object that carried memory in its weight. Caedric stared at it. Then he looked at the forged documents spread across the table beside it. 2 objects. 2 futures. The blade pointed toward one, the documents pointed toward another, and the man standing between them understood with absolute clarity that whichever he reached for first would determine whether House Draven survived the next 48 hours or became a cautionary tale the aristocracy told their children for the next century. He reached for the blade. Caedric exhaled. Not a sigh. Something heavier. The sound of a man watching a door close that would never reopen. "You understand what happens the moment you walk into that council chamber armed." "I understand." "You understand that every alliance you've built over 15 years dissolves the second they see you choose her over procedure. Alliances built on the assumption that I'll always behave predictably were never alliances. They were leashes. And I stopped wearing leashes when my father died. This isn't about your father. Everything in this castle is about my father. Every stone, every protocol, every terrified noble who bows when I enter a room, all of it is architecture he designed to ensure his bloodline would never be vulnerable to anything human. And it worked, Caedric. It worked perfectly. For 34 years I have been exactly the ruler he engineered me to become. Cold, efficient, untouchable." Caedric picked up the sword and held it at his side. The weight familiar in his hand the way gravity was familiar, constant, inescapable. And I'm telling you right now that the man he built is not the man who survives what's coming. That version breaks. He breaks because he has nothing to lose except power, and power without something underneath it is just an elaborate way to die slowly. Caedric watched him. 20 years of service, 20 years of reading this man's silences, interpreting his rages, translating his cruelty into political language the court could digest. In all that time, he had never heard Caedric Draven speak with this particular tone. Not anger, not calculation, but the raw, unfiltered sound of a man who had finally identified the thing he was willing to burn for and discovered that the identification itself was the fire. If you do this, Caedric said quietly, I can't protect you from the consequences. I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to stand behind me when I walk into that chamber. That's all. Stand behind me and let them see that House Draven does not fracture. And if they call for war, then we give them one they'll remember. Caedric looked at the sword, then at the documents, then at the man holding the blade with a grip so steady it contradicted everything the situation demanded. I'll be dressed in 10 minutes, Caedric said, and left the room. Caedric stood alone. The lamplight played across the forged letters on the table. Seraphina's name written in handwriting that wasn't hers, her signature reproduced with the meticulous precision of someone who had studied her correspondence for months. He touched one of the pages. The paper was expensive, crown-quality parchment, which meant the forgery had been manufactured with access to royal resources, which meant the conspiracy reached deeper than Malgrim's coalition, which meant the trap wasn't just political, it was institutional. They wanted her dead, not exiled, not humiliated, dead. Because dead women couldn't testify about what had actually happened behind Lord Varen's closed doors, and dead scandals couldn't metastasize into the kind of truth that toppled the families who had enabled the abuse. Caedric folded the documents and placed them inside his coat. Evidence, ammunition, leverage. His mind was already converting outrage into architecture, fury into tactical sequence. This was the machinery his father had installed in him, the ability to transform any emotion into operational advantage. He had resented it his entire life. Right now, he was grateful for it the way a drowning man is grateful for a piece of wreckage. It kept him functional, while the human part of him wanted to find Malgrim and solve the problem with something far less civilized than politics. He went to Seraphina. The east corridor was quiet. Gray morning light filtered through narrow windows. 2 Draven household guards flanked her door. Men Caedric had personally stationed there 3 days ago, which now appeared less like precaution and more like prophecy. He knocked once, waited. The door opened and Seraphina stood in the doorway wearing a simple linen dress, her hair unbound, her eyes sharp with the particular alertness of someone who had not been sleeping. You already know, he said. Your guards moved positions an hour ago, 4 additional men in the corridor. Either you're preparing for a festival or something happened. She studied his face. Something happened. The Crown Council has issued a formal accusation of treason, forged documents bearing your signature, correspondence allegedly linking you to military intelligence shared with Lord Varen's forces. The evidence is fabricated, perfectly. He watched the information land, watched her body process it before her mind could intervene. The slight widening of her pupils, the fractional shift in her breathing, the way her hand tightened on the doorframe. Fear. Genuine, physiological fear. The kind that bypassed composure and spoke directly to the survival mechanisms embedded in every human nervous system. Then she controlled it, pushed it down, locked it behind the same discipline that had allowed her to endure Malgrim's toast without flinching and a year of exile without breaking. How long do I have? She asked. The council convenes in 3 hours. And tradition requires you to surrender me for trial. Tradition requires many things. She looked at the sword at his side. Her gaze lingered on it. When she looked back at his face, something had changed in her expression. Not gratitude, not relief, but the complicated, terrible recognition of what his decision was going to cost. Don't, she said. Don't what? Don't destroy yourself for me. I won't carry that. Whatever they've manufactured, I can fight it through proper channels. Proper channels manufactured the accusation, Seraphina. The forgeries were produced on crown parchment. Malgrim didn't do this alone. He had institutional support, which means the proper channels are the weapon being used against you, and submitting to them is the same as kneeling for the blade. And the alternative is you walking into that chamber with a sword and telling the entire Crown Council to go to hell. The alternative is me walking into that chamber and making them understand that the cost of touching you exceeds anything they're willing to pay. Her jaw tightened. That's possession, Caedric. That's not protection. There's a difference. The words hit him in a place he hadn't fortified. Because she was right. He knew she was right. The instinct roaring through him, the need to claim, to shield, to make her untouchable, through the sheer gravitational force of his authority, was not clean. It was tangled with something older and darker. The part of him that his father had cultivated, the part that understood the world only in terms of territory, and anything he valued became territory by default. But there was something else beneath it, something his father had never accounted for because the old Duke had never experienced it. The understanding that protection without respect was just captivity with better furniture. And Seraphina had already survived one cage. He would not build her another. I know the difference, he said, and I'm asking you to trust that I do. Trust is a currency I spent down to nothing a long time ago. Then let me earn it. 3 hours. Give me 3 hours and then decide whether what I've done deserves it. She held his gaze. The corridor was silent except for the distant sound of the castle waking, servants moving through lower halls, fires being lit, the mechanical rhythm of a household that didn't yet know its world was about to reorganize itself violently. 3 hours, she said, and closed the door. Caedric stood in the corridor. His pulse was elevated. His breathing was controlled but required more effort than it should have. The guards at either end of the hallway watched him with the careful blankness of men trained to see nothing. He turned and walked toward the council chamber. Every step recalibrated the calculus. Malgrim's coalition. 4 houses confirmed. Kaldern wavering. The Crown's administrative apparatus compromised. Military resources potentially hostile. The eastern provinces uncertain. The northern lords loyal but cautious. Their allegiance was to Draven's strength, not Draven's sentiment, and the moment strength appeared compromised, loyalty would evaporate like frost under direct sun. The mathematics were brutal. Fighting the accusation through legitimate channels meant submitting Seraphina to a tribunal controlled by the people who had forged the evidence. Refusing the tribunal meant open defiance of Crown authority. Defiance meant conflict. Conflict meant choosing between the duchy's institutional survival and one woman's life. His father's voice in his head, cold and precise as a surgical instrument. You are making yourself vulnerable. You are compromising everything this house has built. You are behaving like a man instead of a ruler, and men are disposable. Rulers endure. Caedric kept walking, because his father was right about rulers and wrong about men. A ruler who endured without anything worth enduring for was just a monument, impressive, permanent, and completely hollow. And Caedric had spent 34 years being a monument. He was done. The council chamber occupied the central spine of Blackmere Keep, a vast rectangular hall with vaulted ceilings supported by columns of black stone. The council table dominated the center, a massive slab of ironwood where generations of Draven dukes had adjudicated disputes, signed treaties, and occasionally condemned men to death. Behind the table, a raised platform held the ducal seat. Behind the seat, the Draven banner, a silver wolf on a field of black, hung from ceiling to floor. They were already assembled when Caedric arrived. Lord Malgrim stood at the far end of the table, flanked by representatives from houses Kaldern, Ashworth, and Montague. Behind them, a contingent of Crown Council officials in formal robes. 6 armed guards positioned along the walls, not Draven men, Crown soldiers. Their presence in Blackmere without explicit ducal permission was itself an act of political aggression. Malgrim saw the sword first. His expression shifted. A micro-adjustment, confidence recalculating to accommodate a variable he hadn't predicted. He recovered quickly. Men who built conspiracies for a living learned to absorb surprises without visible disruption. Your Grace, Malgrim's voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades disguising contempt as courtesy. We expected you earlier. The council is prepared to proceed. Caedric walked to the ducal platform. He did not sit. He placed the sword on the council table, the blade pointing directly at Malgrim across the full length of the ironwood surface. Then he stood behind it, hands at his sides, and surveyed the room with the unhurried assessment of a man counting threats. Proceed with what exactly? He said. Lord Ashworth stepped forward. the Crown's senior administrative representative. Thin, meticulous, the kind of man who wielded bureaucracy the way soldiers wielded steel. Your Grace, the Council has received documented evidence of treasonous correspondence between Lady Seraphina Vale and military advisors aligned with Lord Varen of the Southern Reach. The evidence has been authenticated. Protocol requires the accused to be remanded to Crown custody for formal tribunal. Authenticated by whom? Ashworth blinked. The question was procedural, simple, but the tone beneath it suggested that the answer mattered in ways that extended beyond bureaucracy. 3 independent witnesses verified the seal integrity and signature comparison. Lords Malgrim, Caldern, and Montague each provided. 3 men who co-signed the accusation also authenticated the evidence supporting it. Caedric's voice remained level, conversational. The most dangerous register he possessed. That's not authentication, that's choreography. Malgrim's composure hardened. Your Grace, the proper venue for challenging evidence is the tribunal itself. Protocol is clear. The accused must be surrendered to the custody of the accusing body for judgment by a panel selected from the same political faction that manufactured the charges. Caedric placed both hands flat on the table. Tell me, Lord Malgrim, in what framework of reason does the accused receive justice from the architect of her destruction? These are serious allegations, Your Grace. If you're suggesting the evidence was fabricated, I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it as fact. The correspondence was written on Crown parchment available only through royal administrative channels. The signature reproduction required access to Lady Vale's personal correspondence archive, which was seized by Crown officials during her departure from Lord Varen's estate. The military intelligence referenced in the letters pertains to defensive positions that were reconfigured 6 months ago, meaning whoever drafted the forgeries was working from outdated data and didn't know it. Caedric pulled the documents from his coat and spread them across the table. You built a perfect trap, Malgrim, except you staffed it with people who don't understand the difference between intelligence and information. Intelligence is current. This is a museum exhibit. The room shifted, not dramatically, subtly, the way a structure shifts before it fails. Internal stress redistributing, load-bearing assumptions cracking under unexpected pressure. The Crown officials exchanged glances. Lord Caldern's representative took a half-step backward. Small movements, telling ones. Malgrim didn't retreat. Men who had committed to conspiracies this deep couldn't afford retreat. Retreat was admission, and admission was execution. Regardless of your Grace's interpretation, Crown protocol is unambiguous. The accused must be remanded. The accused is under Blackmere's protection. She entered this duchy as a guest under formal patronage. Her safety is my obligation under the same ancient codes you're now weaponizing against her. Caedric straightened. You want to invoke tradition, Malgrim? Fine. Let's talk about tradition. The Draven Compact of 1247 establishes that any individual under ducal protection cannot be removed from duchy territory without the Duke's explicit written consent. The Covenant of Noble Sanctuary states that accusations against a protected guest require independent verification by a neutral party, not by the accusers themselves. And the Blackmere Sovereignty Amendment, ratified by the Crown Council 40 years ago, confirms that no armed force may operate within Blackmere's walls without ducal authorization. He looked at the Crown soldiers along the walls. Those men are in violation of my sovereignty. Every second they remain armed in this chamber is a second I'm choosing not to interpret as an act of war. Silence. The kind that carries weight. The Crown soldiers didn't move, but their discomfort was visible in the slight adjustments of posture. The redirected gazes, the universal body language of men, realizing they had been positioned as pawns in a game that was rapidly exceeding their pay grade. Lord Caldern's representative cleared his throat. Perhaps a recess would be appropriate. To review the procedural. No recess, Malgrim said sharply. The mask was slipping. Beneath the diplomatic veneer, the real architecture of the man was becoming visible. Ambition compressed into a human shape, willing to spend any amount of someone else's suffering to purchase its objectives. Your Grace, you are obstructing Crown justice to protect a woman accused of treason. The implications are that I am protecting a member of my household from a manufactured accusation designed to remove her from my protection so she can be eliminated before the truth about Lord Varen's conduct becomes public. Caedric's voice dropped. Not louder, quieter. The room leaned in involuntarily. The the way people lean toward a sound they instinctively recognize as dangerous. That's what this is about, not treason, not national security. A dead woman can't testify about what happened inside Varen's estate, and the families who enabled it, who arranged the marriage, who ignored the evidence, who profited from the alliance, those families cannot afford a living witness. He looked directly at Malgrim. Can they, Everett? The use of the first name was deliberate, intimate, a violation of protocol that communicated something beyond disrespect. It communicated the complete dissolution of the social framework that had previously governed their interactions. Caedric was no longer speaking to a fellow lord. He was speaking to a man he intended to destroy. Malgrim's face was a study in controlled fury. You are making accusations without evidence. I have evidence. I've had it since the day she arrived. Financial records linking House Malgrim to Lord Varen's estate. Correspondence between your steward and Varen's household staff regarding, how shall I phrase this, the management of domestic incidents. Medical documentation from the physician who treated Lady Vale's injuries and was subsequently paid a significant sum to relocate to a different province. Caedric reached into his coat and produced a second set of documents. He laid them beside the forgeries. You wanted a tribunal, Malgrim. Here's your tribunal. Except the accused isn't Serafina. It's everyone who helped a violent man disguise his violence as marriage and then conspired to silence the woman who survived it. The room detonated. Not with sound, with silence. The absolute crystalline silence that occurs when every person in a room simultaneously processes information that reorganizes their understanding of reality. Crown officials stared at the documents. Lord Caldern's representative had gone pale. The armed soldiers along the walls shifted their weight with the unconscious restlessness of men who had just realized they were standing on the wrong side of something historical. Malgrim's composure held for 3 more seconds. Then it cracked. Not visibly. Internally. Caedric saw it in the eyes. The specific moment when a man's calculation exceeds his options and the machinery of self-preservation begins cannibalizing the machinery of ambition. Those documents are fabricated, Malgrim said. His voice was steady, but the undertone had changed. Defensive where it had been aggressive, reactive where it had been orchestrated. Then submit them to independent verification. A neutral party. Not your coalition, not the Crown officials you've compromised. An independent arbiter selected by mutual agreement. Caedric picked up his sword from the table. Not aggressively, slowly. The way a man reclaims something that belongs to him. Unless, of course, you're unwilling to subject your evidence to the same standard you demanded for hers. Malgrim looked around the room, searching for allies, finding uncertainty. Lord Caldern's representative was studying the floor with the concentrated attention of a man mentally rehearsing his resignation. The Ashworth delegation had retreated into bureaucratic opacity, faces blank, postures neutral, the universal camouflage of administrators who sensed the political wind shifting and refused to be caught leaning the wrong direction. This is not finished, Malgrim said. No, Caedric agreed, it's not. But the part where you control the terms is. Malgrim left the chamber. His delegation followed. The Crown soldiers hesitated, then departed after a terse command from the senior Ashworth official, who paused at the door long enough to give Caedric a look that contained equal measures of professional respect and personal alarm. The chamber emptied. Caedric, who had stood behind the ducal platform throughout the confrontation without speaking a single word, finally moved. He walked to the table and looked at the 2 sets of documents, the forged accusations and Caedric's counter-evidence, lying side by side on the ironwood surface. How long have you had those records? He asked. Since before she arrived. You investigated Varen before Winter Court. I investigated Varen the day I learned she broke the engagement, 5 months ago. Caedric looked at him, a long, measured assessment that recalibrated 20 years of understanding. You planned for this. I planned for something, not this specifically, but the probability that her enemies would move against her once she resurfaced was high enough to justify preparation. 5 months of intelligence gathering, document acquisition, medical record recovery. You did all of this before she even asked for your protection. She didn't ask. She never asked. That's the point. Caedric was quiet for a long time. The war room felt different now. The same stone walls, the same iron markers on the map table, the same ancestral weight pressing down from the vaulted ceiling. But the man standing at its center had shifted, and the room had shifted with him. Malgrim will regroup, Caedric said finally. He has too much invested to retreat. The southern houses will interpret today as a declaration, not a defense. And the crown will need to respond to your sovereignty challenge, or risk establishing precedent that ducal authority supersedes royal jurisdiction. I know. Which means by tomorrow morning, we'll be facing a formal demand for compliance backed by the threat of military intervention. I know. And you have approximately 16 hours to decide whether you're prepared to fight a war against the crown itself to protect one woman. Caedric looked at the silver wolf banner hanging behind the ducal seat, his family's sigil. Generations of men who had built their legacy on the understanding that power was the only currency that never depreciated. They had been right, in a way. Power endured. But they had missed the essential variable, the thing that determined whether power was a foundation or a tomb. Purpose. Power without purpose was just machinery running in the dark, grinding, consuming, producing nothing except the perpetuation of its own function. His father had been the perfect expression of that principle, a man of immense capability who had used it for nothing except the accumulation of more capability, stacking power on top of power, until the structure was so tall it blocked out everything else, including the light. Caedric was done building in the dark. I decided 16 hours ago, he said. The corridor outside the council chamber was empty when Caedric walked it, his boots on the stone, the sword at his side, the weight of what he had just set in motion pressing against his ribs with every breath. He found Seraphina where he knew he would, in the library, standing by the window overlooking the frozen sea, holding a book she wasn't reading. She turned when he entered. Her eyes went to his face, then to the sword, then back to his face. You didn't surrender me, she said. No. What did you do? I showed them what it cost to come for you inside my walls. She set the book down. Her hands were steady, but her breathing had the slightly elevated rhythm of someone managing adrenaline through discipline rather than calm. And now? Now Malgrim regroups, the crown responds. And within 24 hours we find out whether the evidence I've gathered is strong enough to shift the political balance, or whether Blackmere goes to war against half the kingdom. Evidence. Financial records, medical documentation, correspondence. Everything that proves what Varen did to you and who helped him hide it. Her expression changed, not softened, fractured. The composure she had maintained so precisely since her arrival cracked along a fault line he hadn't seen before, and beneath it was something raw and unprocessed and absolutely devastating. You investigated him. Yes. When? 5 months ago. Before I came back. Before any of this. You... She stopped. Her voice had shifted registers, from controlled to something that vibrated with the specific frequency of a person confronting an act of care. So unexpected, it temporarily overwhelmed the defenses they had built against exactly that kind of surprise. Why? Because someone should have done it when it mattered, and no one did, and I am done being the kind of man who notices suffering and files it under someone else's jurisdiction. Seraphina stared at him. The library was quiet. Dust moved in the thin winter light from the window. The frozen sea stretched behind her like a canvas of white nothing, and in front of her stood a man who had just leveraged his entire duchy against a conspiracy designed to destroy her, and done it not because she had asked, but because 5 months ago, alone in a dark study, he had read her name and decided that the world's failure to protect her was a debt he intended to collect. She crossed the room. 3 steps. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the slight tremor in her jaw. Not weakness, exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been bracing against the world for so long that the sudden absence of resistance felt more destabilizing than the pressure itself. If they come for Blackmere, she said quietly, I won't let you lose everything because of me. You don't get to make that decision. The hell I don't. Seraphina, no, listen to me. I spent a year in exile because a man decided my fate without my consent. I will not survive being saved the same way I was destroyed, by someone else choosing for me. If this goes to war, I stand beside you, or I walk out those gates alone. Those are the options. There is no version of this where you lock me in a tower and fight my battles while I wait. Her voice was steel-wrapped in exhaustion, unyielding, absolute. and Caedric recognized it, the same immovable force he encountered every time he looked in a mirror. The refusal to be managed. The insistence on agency, even when agency meant standing in the path of something catastrophic. He could have argued, could have invoked ducal authority, strategic logic, the simple mathematical reality that her presence on a battlefield would be a liability rather than an asset. Instead, he looked at her and saw the thing he had been circling for 9 days without the courage to name. Not desire, not possession, not the territorial instinct his blood and upbringing had wired into him since birth. Partnership. The terrifying, unprecedented concept that another human being could stand beside him, not as a subject or a dependent or a conquest, but as an equal, and that the standing itself might be worth more than everything he had built alone. Beside me, he said, beside you, even if it burns, especially if it burns. He took her hand, not gently, not romantically, the grip of someone sealing a pact. They understood would cost them everything and had already decided the price was acceptable. Outside the library windows, the winter sky was darkening early. Storm clouds massed along the northern horizon like an advancing army. Somewhere inside Blackmere's walls, servants were lighting fires against the coming cold, unaware that the warmth they were building would be insufficient for what the next dawn would bring. And somewhere to the south, a rider was already galloping toward the capital with Lord Malgrim's urgent dispatch, a message that would reach the crown before midnight and set in motion the single largest military mobilization Valadorn had seen in 40 years. The last line of the message read simply and without ambiguity. The Duke has chosen the woman over the crown. Blackmere must fall. The storm hit Blackmere at 2 a.m, not the weather. The weather had been building for hours. Wind hammering the northern walls, sleet coating the battlements in a skin of gray ice, the sea below the cliffs churning with the mindless violence of water that had forgotten how to be still. That storm was noise. Background. The thing servants commented on while carrying firewood through corridors and guards, cursed under their breath during watch rotations. The real storm arrived on horseback. Caedric was in the war room with Caedric when the rider came through the eastern gate. A Draven scout named Tarek, 19 years old, half frozen, his horse lathered and trembling beneath him. The gate captain brought him directly to the keep. He collapsed against the war room doorframe with ice still melting in his hair and blood on his lower lip where the cold had cracked the skin. The crown column departed the capital at sundown, Tarek said between ragged breaths. 1,200 soldiers, siege equipment. They're moving on the northern road. Lord Malgrim rides with them. Caedric moved to the map table. His hands were already shifting iron markers, replotting positions, converting the boy's gasping report into spatial reality. Speed of advance? Forced march. They'll reach Blackmere's outer territory by tomorrow evening. The keep itself within 2 days if the roads hold. The roads won't hold, Caedric said. Not in this weather. 3 days. Maybe 4. 3 days, Caedric repeated. He was standing at the head of the table, both hands flat on the ironwood surface, his eyes moving across the map with the mechanical precision of a man running calculations that had no good answers. 1,200 crown soldiers against Blackmere's garrison of 400. Siege equipment against walls that were strong but not infinite. And behind the numbers, the political reality. The crown itself had authorized the action, which meant this was no longer a dispute between noble houses. This was the kingdom's institutional machinery turning against one of its own. Send riders to the northern lords, Caedric said. Heron, Blackwood, Voss the Elder. Every vassal house within 2 days' ride. Full mobilization. I want 600 additional men inside these walls before that column reaches our border. And if they don't come, Caedric asked, then we hold with 400 and make them bleed for every foot. Tarek was escorted to the infirmary. Caedric dispatched the riders within the hour. 6 men on fast horses, carrying sealed orders bearing the Draven wolf, scattering into the frozen darkness toward allied holdings across the northern provinces. The machinery of war engaged with the grim efficiency Blackmere was built for. Armorers woke. Weapon stores opened. The garrison shifted to siege footing, men moving through the castle with the focused quiet of professionals who understood that the difference between preparation and panic was discipline. Caedric watched all of it from the war room. He tracked reports, issued orders, managed logistics. Every decision precise, every calculation sound. The operational part of his mind was performing exactly as designed. His father's architecture at its finest, converting chaos into structure, threat into protocol, fear into function. But beneath the machinery, something else was running. A parallel process he couldn't shut down. The awareness that everything happening in this castle, every soldier checking a blade, every wall being reinforced, every supply calculation scratched onto parchment, was happening because he had chosen one woman over the entire political order that had sustained his family for generations. And in approximately 72 hours, the bill for that choice would arrive in the form of 1,200 armed men and the kingdom's full institutional wrath. He didn't regret it. That was the part that should have disturbed him and didn't. Regret required the belief that a different choice would have been acceptable, and Caedric had moved past that possibility the moment he walked into the council chamber with a sword. The decision was made. The architecture was committed. What remained was execution, survival, and the grim arithmetic of making the cost of conquest exceed the value of victory. By dawn, the castle was transformed. Supply wagons had been diverted from the winter stores to reinforce the main gates. The outer courtyard was cleared of ceremonial structures and converted into a staging area. The winter court guests, 300 nobles who had come to Blackmere for politics and entertainment, found themselves trapped inside a fortress preparing for siege, their silk wardrobes and diplomatic agendas suddenly irrelevant against the reality of iron and stone and approaching violence. Most of them were terrified, a few were calculating, and at least a dozen, Caedric knew, were already looking for ways to betray him from the inside. He addressed the court at mid-morning. The great hall. Every noble present, no music, no wine, no ceremonial pretense. Just 300 aristocrats standing in clusters beneath the iron chandeliers while the Duke of Blackmere stood on the dais and told them what was coming. A crown military column is advancing on this position. They will arrive within 3 days. Any guest who wishes to depart Blackmere may do so freely before the roads become impassable. Transport will be provided. No one will be detained or questioned. Those who choose to remain do so with the understanding that this castle will not surrender, and the protections of hospitality will extend to the full duration of the conflict. He paused. Let the silence work. 300 faces staring up at him, each one processing the information through its own filter of fear, ambition, loyalty, and self-preservation. I will not explain my decisions to this assembly. I will not negotiate terms dictated by manufactured accusations and institutional corruption. What I will tell you is this. Blackmere has stood for 300 years. It has survived sieges, betrayals, and every attempt by the crown to reduce the northern provinces to administrative territory. It will survive this. He stepped down from the dais without taking questions. The hall erupted into the controlled chaos of 300 people simultaneously trying to decide whether to flee or stay, calculating odds, weighing allegiances, measuring the distance between the Duke's confidence and reality. By noon, 47 nobles had requested departure. Their carriages formed a line through the eastern gate and disappeared into the frozen landscape like a retreating column of their own. Among them were representatives from 6 minor houses, the entire Ashworth administrative delegation, and Lord Caldern's nephew, a departure that confirmed what Caedric had already suspected. House Caldern had chosen its side, and it wasn't his. The remaining nobles settled into the uneasy rhythm of a castle at war. Some offered support. Most simply waited, watching events with the passive attention of people who had survived political upheaval before and understood that the safest position was usually the last one committed to. Serafina found him in the armory that afternoon. He was inspecting crossbow stocks with the garrison commander when she appeared in the doorway, wearing a heavy wool dress that replaced the silver silk of her court wardrobe. Practical. Unadorned. The transformation was small but significant. She had stopped dressing like a guest and started dressing like someone who intended to stay. I want access to the intelligence reports, she said without preamble. The garrison commander looked at Caedric. Caedric dismissed him with a nod. The man left. The armory door closed. You want access to military intelligence during an active siege preparation. I want access to whatever you have on Malgrim's network, financial records, correspondence, the evidence you presented at the council hearing, all of it. Why? Because you built a legal case against him and it wasn't enough. The Crown mobilized anyway, which means your evidence was sufficient to embarrass Malgrim, but insufficient to dismantle the institutional support behind him. The forgeries were produced on Crown parchment. The accusation was co-signed by 4 houses. That level of coordination requires a structure, funding channels, communication protocols, shared objectives. If we can identify the structure, we can collapse it from the inside instead of trying to survive a siege from the outside. Caedric looked at her. The armory's lamplight caught the angles of her face, sharper than they had been 9 days ago, the comfortable softness of court life stripped away by the velocity of events, until what remained was pure operational architecture. She wasn't asking to be included as a gesture. She was identifying a strategic gap and proposing to fill it. You have experience with intelligence analysis. I have experience with Lord Varen's household. A man who conceals violence behind public charm requires a sophisticated system of information management, controlled access, compartmentalized staff, manufactured narratives. I spent 3 years inside that system. I learned how it works by learning how to survive it. The sentence carried more weight than its clinical delivery suggested. 3 years inside a system designed to contain her. 3 years studying the architecture of her own captivity. Not for academic interest, but because understanding the cage was the only tool available for eventually escaping it. The files are in the war room, Caedric said. Caedric will give you full access. She nodded and turned to leave. Serafina. She stopped. The information in those files includes details about Varen's conduct that I obtained through methods the Crown would consider illegal. Intercepted correspondence, bribed officials, medical records acquired without authorization. If any of it becomes public through channels traceable to you, it won't protect you. It will be used as additional evidence of conspiracy. I'm already accused of treason. The penalty is execution. Additional charges seem somewhat academic at this point. She left the armory. Caedric listened to her footsteps fade down the stone corridor and realized, with something between admiration and unease, that the woman he had set out to protect was rapidly becoming a more effective strategist than half the men currently fortifying his walls. The Northern Lords responded within 36 hours. Lord Heron sent 200 men, heavy infantry, well-armed, loyal to the Draven name, for reasons that had more to do with profitable trade agreements than personal affection. Lord Blackwood contributed 150, along with a personal message that read, "In its entirety, Malgrim tried to annex my eastern timber rights in the spring. Consider this a down payment on revenge." Lord Voss the Elder, Caedric's distant cousin and patriarch of a minor but strategically positioned border house, sent 80 soldiers and a supply train of grain, salted meat, and crossbow bolts. 430 additional men. Combined with the garrison, Blackmere now held 830 soldiers against a crown column of 1,200. The numbers weren't favorable, but they weren't catastrophic. Behind walls this thick, with supply lines secured and winter working against the attackers, 800 defenders could hold for weeks, months if the weather cooperated. Caedric should have felt something approaching confidence. Instead, the instinct that had kept him alive through 15 years of political warfare was sending a different signal entirely. A frequency he recognized but couldn't yet source. The feeling of a trap that had already closed but hadn't yet revealed its teeth. It came on the second night. Caedric was in the war room, alone, reviewing the deployment schedules Caedric had drafted for the wall defenses. The castle was quiet in the way fortresses are quiet before violence. Not peaceful, but held. Compressed. Every sound carrying further than it should, every silence heavier than the architecture could explain. The door opened. Caedric entered. And Caedric knew instantly that something was wrong, because Hadric's face was carrying an expression he had never seen in 2 decades of proximity. Not concern, not calculation, not the measured gravity of a professional managing bad news. Something beneath all of those. Something that looked, impossibly, like grief. "What?" Caedric said. Caedric closed the door behind him. He stood with his back against it, as though the physical contact with solid wood was necessary to support what he was about to deliver. "Lord Heron's men," Caedric said. "The 200 infantry that arrived this morning." "What about them?" "They're not Heron's men." The sentence landed in the room like a blade hitting stone, clean, final. The kind of impact that doesn't echo because the surface it strikes is too hard to vibrate. Explain, Caedric said. His voice was level. His pulse was not. Captain Aldrich noticed inconsistencies during the evening inspection. Equipment markings that didn't match Heron's armory standards. Boot patterns from Southern manufacture. He pulled 3 men for individual questioning. Under pressure, the first one broke within 20 minutes. Caedric moved to the table and placed a folded piece of parchment on its surface. Caedric didn't pick it up. He already understood what it contained. "They're Malgrim soldiers," Caedric said, "re-equipped in Heron's colors, smuggled inside our walls under the guise of allied reinforcements. Heron himself may be compromised, or Malgrim intercepted the riders and substituted his own column. Either way, 200 enemy soldiers are currently stationed inside Blackmere's inner garrison, armed, positioned, and awaiting a signal to open the gates from inside when the crown column arrives." Caedric's hands were flat on the table. He stared at the map. The Iron Wolf marker at the center of Blackmere, surrounded by allied positions that now included 200 men whose loyalty was a lie. The mathematics recalculated instantly. Not 830 defenders against 1,200 attackers, but 630 defenders against 1,400, with the enemy already inside the walls. The architecture of his survival had just been hollowed out from the inside. "Who else knows?" Caedric said. "Captain Aldrich, the 3 men he questioned who are currently in the lower cells, and you." The other 197. Still in the eastern barracks, armed, unaware that we've identified them, for now. For now. Aldrich has 50 of our most reliable men positioned around the barracks perimeter. If we move quickly, we can disarm and detain them before they realize they've been compromised. But the window is narrow. If even one of them signals Malgrim's column, the gates open and we die inside our own fortress. Caedric straightened. His spine felt like iron, not strength, rigidity. The structural response of a man absorbing an impact so severe that flexibility would mean collapse. Heron. Unknown. If he was coerced or bought, he may still have sent genuine troops that were intercepted en route. If he was part of it from the beginning, Caedric didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. If Heron was part of the conspiracy, then the betrayal wasn't tactical. It was personal. A man Caedric had trusted, not closely, not warmly, but with the professional reliability that passed for trust among the Northern Lords, had sold Blackmere's survival for whatever Malgrim had offered him. Caedric looked at the map. The iron markers. The positions he had plotted so carefully. Every defensive calculation built on the assumption that the men inside his walls were his, that the reinforcements who answered his call were genuine, that the system of loyalty and obligation that held the northern provinces together would function as designed when the pressure came. Every assumption wrong, not because the system had failed, because the system had never existed the way he believed it did. Loyalty among the Northern Lords was not structural, it was transactional. A network of agreements held together by mutual profit, sustained by the credible threat of Draven retaliation, and absolutely conditional on the belief that siding with the Duke was safer than siding against him. The moment that belief wavered, the moment Malgrim's crown column made the alternative calculation viable, the loyalty evaporated like it had never been real. Because it hadn't been. Caedric's father had built his alliances the same way he built everything else, on fear and advantage. And Caedric had inherited those alliances and maintained them with the same tools, never questioning the foundation because the structure above it was so impressive it seemed permanent. But fear, he understood now, was a building material with a fatal flaw. It held only as long as the thing generating it remained the most frightening option available. The moment something more frightening appeared, the crown's full military weight, the institutional power of the kingdom itself, fear switched allegiance with the mechanical indifference of water finding a new channel downhill. He had built on sand and called it stone because it was the only material his father had taught him to use. "Give the order," Caedric said. "Disarm and detain. Every one of them. If any resist, use whatever force is necessary. I want it done before the next watch rotation. And then? And then we hold this castle with 600 men against an army that already knows our defensive layout, our supply reserves, and our wall vulnerabilities, because those 200 men have been inside Blackmere for 36 hours, and every one of them has been mapping everything they could see." Caedric absorbed this. The defense plan is compromised. The defense plan is worthless. Rebuild it from nothing. New wall assignments. New gate protocols. Relocate every supply cache they could have observed. I want this castle to be a different fortress by morning than the one those men reported to Malgrim. That's a 12-hour reconstruction during active siege preparation. Then we better start now. Caedric turned toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the iron handle. His back was to Caedric. When he spoke, his voice carried something rare for a man who had spent his life managing crisis with professional detachment. There's something else. Caedric waited. The three men Aldrich questioned. Under pressure, the first one gave up the infiltration plan. Standard intelligence extraction. But the second one volunteered information without being pressed. He wanted to talk. About what? Caedric turned around. His face had aged 10 years in the last hour. The grief that Caedric had identified when the advisor entered the room was still there, but now it had a name, and the name was something worse than military catastrophe. About Seraphina. The air in the room changed, not temperature, density, as though the space between the two men had suddenly filled with something heavier than atmosphere. What about her? Caedric said. His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. The register Caedric recognized as the one that preceded decisions other men spent years regretting. According to this soldier, Malgrim didn't discover Seraphina's return to aristocratic society by accident. He was informed, months before Winter Court. He received a detailed report of her plans, the Marchioness's patronage, the timing of her arrival, her intention to seek reinstatement. The report included personal information, her psychological state, her vulnerabilities, her specific connection to you. Informed by whom? Caedric placed a second piece of parchment on the table. This one bore a seal Caedric didn't immediately recognize. Not a noble house, not the crown. A personal seal. Private. The kind used for correspondence that existed outside official channels. The soldier claims the information was provided by someone inside Seraphina's own circle, someone who had access to her plans from the beginning and fed them to Malgrim in exchange for financial consideration and a guarantee of immunity. A name, Caedric, the Marchioness of Dunhaven. The room tilted, not physically, perceptually. The way reality shifts when a foundational assumption is removed and the structures built upon it suddenly have nothing beneath them. The Marchioness of Dunhaven, Seraphina's patron, her protector, the elderly noblewoman who had provided the political cover for her return to court, who had walked beside her through Blackmere's doors, who had positioned herself as the last remaining link to Seraphina's dead mother and the only aristocratic ally she had left, the woman Seraphina trusted. Caedric looked at the seal on the parchment. His mind was doing what it always did under extreme stress, converting emotion into analysis, pain into pattern recognition, the howling fury beneath his ribs into operational data. The Marchioness had been feeding intelligence to Malgrim, which meant Seraphina's arrival at Winter Court wasn't a return, it was a delivery. The patronage wasn't protection, it was positioning. Every element of Seraphina's re-entry into aristocratic society had been choreographed not to shelter her, but to place her exactly where her enemies needed her to be. Inside Blackmere. Inside Caedric's proximity. Inside the only scenario that would give Malgrim's coalition the leverage to mobilize the crown against the most powerful duchy in the kingdom. Seraphina was the weapon. And the woman who carried her here had aimed her directly at Caedric's only vulnerability. He picked up the parchment. Read the contents. Financial transfer records. Dates. Amounts. A communication chain linking the Marchioness to Malgrim's steward through 3 intermediary accounts. The architecture of betrayal laid out with the clinical precision of a banking transaction, because that's ultimately what it was. One old woman selling one young woman's safety for enough gold to maintain a crumbling estate and a lifestyle that had been hemorrhaging money for a decade. Does Seraphina know? Caedric asked. No. Where's the Marchioness now? Guest quarters. East Wing. She elected to remain when the other nobles departed, presumably to maintain proximity and continue reporting. Or because Malgrim told her to stay. Another set of eyes inside the walls. That too. Caedric set the parchment down. He looked at his hands. Steady. Functional. The machinery still working even as the man operating it processed something that felt less like anger and more like the total structural failure of a belief system he hadn't realized he was still depending on. Trust. The naive, persistent, apparently indestructible belief that somewhere beneath the politics and the violence and the transactional machinery of aristocratic life, there existed bonds that couldn't be purchased, loyalty that wasn't conditional, protection that meant what it claimed to mean. His father had never believed in any of it. His father had operated on the assumption that every human relationship was a transaction waiting to reveal its price, and that the only defense against betrayal was ensuring you never invested enough in anyone to make betrayal painful. And here stood his son, invested, exposed, having built a war around a woman who had been placed in his path by the very conspiracy he was fighting, delivered by a traitor wearing the face of maternal loyalty, aimed at the single crack in his armor that no amount of political engineering could seal. The old Duke would have laughed. Then he would have surrendered Serafina, eliminated the Marchioness, negotiated terms with Malgrim, and resumed governing as though none of it had ever touched him. Efficient, ruthless, survivable. The architecture of emotional absence performing exactly as intended. Caedric could not do that. Not because he was weaker than his father, because he was standing in the wreckage of his father's design and could see what the old man never could, that the architecture of invulnerability was itself the greatest vulnerability. A man who trusted nothing had nothing to betray, but he also had nothing to defend, and a fortress with nothing inside it worth protecting was just an expensive tomb. He had something worth protecting. She was in the war room down the corridor, analyzing intelligence documents with the same ferocity she had once used to survive 3 years inside a violent man's household. And she didn't know that the woman who had brought her back into the world had done it for money. He had to tell her. He had to walk down that corridor and hand her another piece of evidence that the world was exactly as cruel as she had always suspected, and he had to do it knowing that the information would cost her something he couldn't replace. The last fragment of trust she had placed in someone from her former life, the belief that at least one person had wanted to help her without a price attached. "Detain the Marchioness," Caedric said, quietly. "No confrontation. Escort her to a secured room and post guards. I don't want her communicating with anyone inside or outside this castle. And Serafina? I'll handle it." Caedric. He looked at Caedric. The advisor's face held something that exceeded professional concern, something that looked, impossibly, like personal investment in the outcome. Not for the duchy, not for the political calculus, but for the two people at the center of a catastrophe that was tightening around them like a fist. "She's stronger than you think," Caedric said. "I know how strong she is. That's not what I'm worried about." "Then what?" "I'm worried about what happens to someone who keeps surviving betrayals. Not whether they break. Whether they stop being able to feel anything when the next one comes. Because that's the real damage. Not the pain, the numbness that replaces it. I watched it happen to my father. I've spent my entire life watching it happen to myself." He picked up the parchment bearing the Marchioness's seal and walked out of the war room. The corridor to the library was 37 steps. He had counted them once, years ago, during one of the insomnia-driven walks that had become his nightly ritual since adolescence. 37 steps of black stone worn smooth by generations of Draven boots. He walked them now with the parchment in his hand, and the absolute certainty that what waited at the other end was the hardest conversation of his life. Serafina was at the table. Malgrim's financial records spread around her like the dissected anatomy of a conspiracy. She had organized them into clusters, funding sources, communication channels, timeline correlations. Her hair was pulled back. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. She looked like someone who had found a problem she could solve and was applying every ounce of intelligence she possessed to solving it. And the concentration on her face was so fierce and so alive that Caedric had to stop in the doorway and absorb the specific cruelty of what he was about to do. She looked up. Read his expression. The concentration faded and something colder replaced it. The instinct of a woman who had learned to recognize the approach of bad news the way animals recognize the approach of weather. "What happened?" she said. He walked to the table, placed the parchment in front of her, said nothing. She read it. He watched her read it. Watched the information travel through her. The recognition of the seal first, the confusion, then the understanding, then the slow, devastating recalibration as every memory she had of the Marchioness reorganized itself around a new central fact. The old woman at the door of Blackmere walking beside her. The letters of support during exile. The warm voice on the other side of correspondence that had felt, during the darkest months, like the only evidence that someone in the world still remembered she existed. All of it purchased, all of it performed. A transaction dressed in affection, executed with the patience of someone who understood that trust was the most valuable currency in the world because it was the only one people handed over willingly. Serafina set the parchment down. Her hands were flat on the table. Her breathing was controlled. Her eyes were dry. And Caedric recognized the expression on her face because he had worn it himself not 10 minutes ago in the war room. The expression of someone absorbing an impact so complete that the body's first response was not pain, but silence. The nervous system overloaded, the emotional architecture temporarily offline, while the survival machinery assessed damage and calculated whether the structure could bear weight again. "How long?" she said. "The financial records go back 14 months, before your return was public knowledge. She planned it. Malgrim planned it. She provided access. She provided me." The sentence was quiet, precise. It carried the weight of something far larger than its 3 words suggested. The total, irreversible understanding that the person who had made her return possible had done so, not out of love or loyalty or the memory of her dead mother, but out of the simple, devastating arithmetic of exchanging one woman's safety for financial solvency. Serafina stood. The chair scraped against stone. She walked to the window and placed both hands on the cold sill, and stood there with her back to him. And Caedric watched her shoulders rise and fall, with the deliberate rhythm of someone manually controlling their breathing, because the automatic systems had failed. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't offer comfort or analysis or strategy. He stood in the middle of the library and gave her the one thing no one in her life had ever given her when the world collapsed: space to feel it without being watched, managed, or redirected. The minutes passed. The storm outside battered the windows. The fire in the library hearth crackled and popped with the indifferent cheerfulness of combustion that didn't care what was happening in the room. It heated. When Serafina turned around, her face was different. Not broken. Reconstructed. The grief was there. He could see it in the tension around her jaw, the slight redness at the edges of her eyes. But it had been processed through something harder than sorrow. Something that looked like the final abandonment of a hope she had been carrying without admitting it. The hope that somewhere in the machinery of aristocratic life, there existed at least one relationship that was exactly what it appeared to be. That hope was dead now. And the woman standing in its absence was not weaker. She was terrifying. "The Marchioness knows Blackmere's internal layout," Serafina said. Her voice was level, operational. "She knows the guest wing access points, the corridor routes, the location of the war room. If she's been reporting to Malgrim, she's already transmitted a detailed map of every vulnerability she could observe. She's been detained. Good. Her correspondence needs to be seized. Every letter she sent or received since arriving. If she used Blackmere's courier system, there are records. If she used her own channels, her personal effects will contain evidence." "Already ordered." Serafina nodded. She looked at the intelligence documents spread across the table. Then she looked at Caedric with an expression that contained no softness, no vulnerability, and absolutely no illusion about the world they were both operating inside. "We have 200 enemy soldiers to neutralize, a compromised defensive plan to rebuild, a siege force arriving in less than 48 hours, and every ally we thought we had is either bought, coerced, or waiting to see who wins before they commit. Is that an accurate summary?" "That's accurate." "Then stop looking at me like I might shatter and start treating me like what I am. The only person in this castle whose loyalty you don't have to question." She sat back down at the table, pulled the financial records toward her, resumed working. Caedric watched her for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back to the war room to dismantle 200 infiltrators before dawn, rebuild a fortress defense from scratch, and prepare for a war that had just become exponentially harder to win. Behind him, in the library, Serafina organized the evidence of her own betrayal into operational intelligence, with the methodical precision of a woman who had finally stopped expecting the world to be kind and started making it pay for the privilege of being cruel. The night swallowed Blackmere whole. By midnight, Captain Aldrich's men had moved. The Eastern Barracks operation was surgical. 50 Draven soldiers entering through 4 access points simultaneously, disarming the infiltrators in their bunks before the majority could reach weapons. 14 resisted, 6 were killed. The remaining 194 were shackled and transferred to the lower cell block in groups of 20, processed through the castle's detention corridors, like cargo being rerouted. By 2 in the morning, the defense reconstruction was underway. Caedric coordinated the repositioning of every wall assignment, gate protocol, and supply cache. Men moved through the castle carrying weapons and provisions to new locations, erasing the map that Malgrim's soldiers had spent 36 hours memorizing and replacing it with something entirely different. By 4 in the morning, the Marchioness's correspondence had been seized, catalogued, and delivered to the library where Seraphina worked. And by the time gray winter light began bleeding through Blackmere's eastern windows, Caedric stood on the north wall overlooking the frozen landscape and understood with absolute clarity that what was coming could no longer be survived with the tools he had inherited. Strength would not be enough. Fear would not be enough. The cold, mechanical precision that had made House Draven untouchable for 3 generations would not be enough. Because the enemy had already been inside the walls. Because the allies had already been compromised. Because every system built on control and intimidation had just demonstrated its fundamental failure. The inability to distinguish between compliance and loyalty, between obedience and trust. His father's architecture was collapsing. Not under enemy assault, but under its own structural limitations. And the man standing in the ruins had exactly 48 hours to build something new from the wreckage. Not a better version of the old design, but something fundamentally different. Something his bloodline had never attempted because it required the one material no Draven had ever been willing to use. Vulnerability. The willingness to need people rather than simply command them. The willingness to be wrong, to be wounded, to ask for help instead of demanding obedience. The terrifying, incomprehensible act of building a defense, not on the fear of consequences, but on the genuine investment of people who chose to stand beside him because they believed in what he was protecting. He did not know how to do this. His father had never taught him. His bloodline had never modeled it. Every instinct in his body screamed that opening himself further was suicide, that the correct response to betrayal was fortification, not expansion. But fortification was how he had gotten here. Fortification was the strategy that had left him standing on a wall with 600 men against 1,400, every alliance crumbling, every assumption demolished, preparing to fight the kingdom itself with nothing but stone walls and a woman in his library who had just watched her last trusted relationship turn to ash and responded by getting back to work. If she could do that, if she could absorb that level of devastation and convert it into forward motion, then he could do what she had been demanding of him since the night on the terrace. Stop controlling, start trusting, let the walls come down and find out what survived on the other side. Caedric turned from the parapet and walked back inside the castle. The storm was still building, the crown column was still advancing, and somewhere inside the frozen corridors of Blackmere Keep, a man who had spent his entire life being untouchable was about to attempt the most dangerous thing he had ever done: become reachable. He started with the garrison, not the officers, not the commanders who had sworn formal oaths and maintained their loyalty through contractual obligation. Caedric went to the men on the walls, the soldiers pulling overnight watch in frozen wind, the crossbowmen checking bolts by lamplight, the infantry sharpening blades that would meet crown steel within 48 hours. Men whose names he had never learned because his father's architecture classified soldiers as instruments rather than individuals, and instruments did not require personal recognition to function. He learned their names now. It took him 4 hours, walking every section of wall, every gate position, every supply station and weapons cache that Caedric's overnight reconstruction had established. At each post he stopped. He spoke to the men stationed there. Not commands, not the clipped operational language of a duke issuing orders to subordinates. Conversation. The raw, uncomfortable, unprecedented act of a ruler asking soldiers what they needed, what they feared, what they thought about the fight that was coming. The reactions ranged from confusion to suspicion to something that looked, in a few cases, like cautious respect. These men had served under Draven authority their entire careers. They understood the hierarchy. They performed within it competently. But none of them had ever been asked for their assessment by the man at the top of it, because the man at the top had never considered their assessments relevant. Caedric considered them relevant now, not because he had suddenly become sentimental, Because 200 enemy soldiers had walked through his gates disguised as allies, and his vetting systems had missed them, and the men who actually manned the walls, who saw the daily details, who noticed the wrong boot patterns, and the unfamiliar equipment markings, those men had caught what his intelligence apparatus had not. Captain Aldrich's observation had saved Blackmere. Not Caedric's strategy, not Caedric's planning, a captain's eye for detail, and the instinct to question what didn't feel right. The fortress had nearly fallen because Caedric trusted systems over people. He would not make that mistake with the next 48 hours. By mid-morning, a different energy was moving through the garrison. Subtle, nothing dramatic. But the men walked differently, spoke differently. The mechanical compliance that had characterized Blackmere's military culture for decades had shifted, almost imperceptibly, towards something that carried a different weight. Not obedience, investment. The distinction was invisible from the outside but structural from within. The difference between soldiers following orders because the consequences of refusal were severe, and soldiers following a man because he had looked them in the eye and treated their judgment as something worth hearing. Caedric noticed. He said nothing. But the expression he wore as he watched Caedric move through the garrison told its own story. The look of a man watching someone he had known for 20 years become someone he didn't entirely recognize, and finding the transformation not alarming but overdue. The Crown Column was sighted at 1400 hours. A scout on the eastern ridge flagged the signal. 3 torch bursts, the Draven warning code for large force approach. Caedric was on the north wall within minutes, a field scope pressed to his eye, scanning the frozen road that wound through the valley below Blackmere's cliffs. They came out of the tree line in formation, not a ragged advance, a disciplined military column stretching back along the road like a steel spine laid across the white landscape. Infantry in crown blue and gray, cavalry flanking in organized squadrons. Behind them, the siege equipment, battering rams on wheeled platforms, scaling ladders bundled on carts, and 3 trebuchets being pulled by ox teams through the snow. The kind of hardware that turned castle walls from permanent structures into temporary obstacles. 1,200 men, possibly more. The column was still emerging from the forest, its full length not yet visible. At the front, beneath a banner bearing the crown's golden sigil alongside Malgrim's personal standard, rode a cluster of mounted officers. Caedric lowered the scope. His jaw was tight, his breathing measured. The sight of the column was not a surprise. They had known it was coming, had prepared for it, had rebuilt the entire defense around it. But there was a difference between knowing a thing intellectually and seeing it materialize across the landscape with the physical reality of steel and wood and 1,200 men who had been authorized to kill everyone inside these walls. His body knew the difference, even if his mind refused to acknowledge it. Elevated pulse. Adrenaline beginning its slow climb through his bloodstream. The primitive threat response systems that no amount of political sophistication could override, because they operated beneath consciousness in the ancient machinery of survival that didn't care about titles or strategies or the elaborate justifications men constructed for the violence they committed. Caedric appeared beside him on the wall. He carried a rolled dispatch in one hand. "They've sent terms," Caedric said. Caedric took the dispatch, read it standing on the battlement with the wind pulling at his coat and the enemy column arranging itself across the valley floor below. The terms were simple. Surrender Lady Seraphina Vale to Crown custody for tribunal. Submit to formal investigation of ducal authority overreach. Accept a Crown administrative presence within Blackmere for a period of no less than 5 years to ensure compliance with noble code. Failure to accept within 6 hours would result in military action authorized by the full Crown Council. Caedric read the terms twice. Then he handed the dispatch to Caedric. 6 hours, he said. 6 hours. Draft a response. 2 words. Come try. Caedric took the dispatch. His expression carried the specific blend of professional horror and personal admiration that had characterized most of his reactions over the past 72 hours. You understand that this eliminates any possibility of diplomatic resolution. There was never a possibility of diplomatic resolution. Malgrim didn't march 1,200 men and 3 trebuchets through a winter storm to negotiate. He came to demonstrate that defying the institutional order has consequences. Our response needs to demonstrate that the consequences flow in both directions. 2 words. 2 words. Caedric left the wall. Caedric remained, watching the Crown Column complete its deployment across the valley. They were establishing a siege perimeter, a half-ring of positions anchored against the cliff approaches on either side, cutting Blackmere off from the inland roads while leaving the sea approach open. A traditional siege configuration. Textbook. Which meant they expected a traditional defense, and their planning was built on the intelligence gathered by 200 infiltrators who were now shackled in the lower cell block instead of positioned to open the gates. Malgrim didn't know his inside force was compromised. Not yet. That was the single tactical advantage Blackmere possessed, and its value had an expiration date measured in hours. The moment the assault began and the gates failed to open from inside, Malgrim would understand the betrayal had been discovered, and his strategy would adapt accordingly. The window between that realization and the adapted assault was Blackmere's margin of survival. Caedric had to make it count. He descended from the wall and convened the War Council, not in the formal chamber, in the garrison mess hall, surrounded by soldiers eating their evening meal. Officers, sergeants, wall captains, and supply chiefs crowded around a table covered with maps, while infantry ate bread and dried meat at the benches behind them. The symbolism was deliberate. The men who would fight needed to see the men who planned the fight, and the men who planned needed to remember that their calculations would be paid for in the blood of the men eating behind them. Malgrim expects the gates to open from inside during the initial assault, Caedric said without preamble. His infiltrators were positioned to disable the eastern gate mechanism and create a breach point for cavalry entry. That's not happening, which means his first assault will be designed around an internal breach that doesn't exist. When the gates stay closed, his formation will be committed to an approach that has no resolution. They'll be exposed in the kill zone for approximately 7 minutes before they can reorganize. He looked around the table. Every face was focused, tight, the expression of men doing math with their own survival. 7 minutes is what we have. I want every crossbow on the eastern wall loaded and ready before the first ram reaches the gate. The moment their formation stalls, we hit them from elevation. Concentrated fire on the cavalry approach. Horses go down, the column behind them bottlenecks. Captain Aldrich, your men hold the gate interior. If anything breaches, you collapse the corridor and make them fight through a choke point 12 feet wide. Nobody gets through that corridor while you're breathing. Aldrich nodded, no hesitation. The kind of nod that came from a man who had already decided what he was willing to spend and had made peace with the price. What about the trebuchets? One of the wall captains asked. A stocky man named Vance with a scar that ran from his hairline to his jaw. He had survived 2 border skirmishes and spoke with the blunt economy of someone who had learned that unnecessary words cost unnecessary time. The trebuchets are Malgrim's insurance. He doesn't want to use them. Destroying Blackmere's walls reduces the value of the prize. He wants surrender, not rubble. The trebuchets are psychological. They're positioned to be visible, not effective. Their current range puts them at the extreme limit for accuracy, which means he'd have to advance them closer to be operational, which means moving heavy equipment through snow under crossbow range. And if he does? Then we have oil, lots of it, the supply cache. Caedric relocated overnight includes 40 barrels of lamp oil positioned along the eastern wall drainage channels. Trebuchets are made of wood. Wood burns. A murmur ran through the room. Not confidence, something rawer. The visceral recognition that the man at the table was not performing command theater. He was thinking like someone who intended to win with 600 men against an army, and the specificity of his planning suggested he had been running these calculations long enough to have found answers that weren't obvious. The briefing lasted another 30 minutes. Assignments were distributed, contingencies established, medical stations identified, retreat protocols defined for scenarios ranging from partial breach to full wall failure. Every decision was precise, practical, and delivered in language that respected the men receiving it by refusing to minimize what they were facing. When the officers dispersed, Caedric remained in the mess hall. The soldiers eating at the benches behind him had listened to every word. He had known they would. That was why he'd held the briefing here instead of the sealed war room where planning was traditionally conducted behind closed doors and filtered down through the chain of command in sanitized fragments. These men deserved to know what was coming, all of it, the odds, the strategy, the contingencies, and the honest assessment that surviving the next 24 hours would require every person inside these walls to perform beyond what anyone had a right to expect. His father would have called it weakness. Sharing information with common soldiers, treating their understanding as operationally relevant. The old Duke had believed that ignorance was a management tool, that men who knew only their immediate task performed it more reliably than men burdened with the larger picture. Caedric was betting that his father was wrong, that men who understood what they were fighting for fought harder than men who were simply told where to stand, that the difference between a garrison and a fortress was not the stone but the people inside it, and people who felt trusted became trustworthy in ways that no amount of discipline could manufacture. It was the biggest gamble of his life, and in approximately 4 hours the crown column would test whether it paid off. Serafina came to him at dusk. He was in the armory, alone, strapping on the chest plate he hadn't worn since the border skirmishes 3 years ago. The leather was stiff from storage. The buckles required force. He worked them with fingers that operated on mechanical memory while his mind ran final calculations, wall positions, ammunition counts, retreat corridors, the 7-minute window that represented the difference between survival and annihilation. She appeared in the doorway carrying a leather satchel. Her hair was braided back. She wore the heavy wool dress from the day before, now supplemented with a leather vest that looked like it had been borrowed from a garrison supply closet. Practical. Armored in the only way available to her. "The Marchioness talked," she said. Caedric paused mid-buckle. "Voluntarily?" "I asked her, face to face. She didn't resist." Serafina set the satchel on the armory table and opened it. Inside were documents, letters, financial records, a bound journal. "She's been corresponding with Malgrim for 16 months. But not just Malgrim. The network is deeper than we mapped. House Varen, House Montague, and 2 Crown Council ministers are directly involved. The journal documents meetings, agreements, financial transfers, everything. She kept a journal of her own conspiracy. She's an old woman who has spent her life being insignificant. When powerful men finally included her in something that mattered, she documented it because it was the most important thing she had ever been part of. Vanity. The same vanity that makes men commission portraits of themselves in armor they never wore into battle. The observation was sharp, clinical, delivered without bitterness, which made it more devastating than any expression of anger could have been. Serafina had processed the betrayal and emerged on the other side, not wounded but weaponized. The pain was still there. He could see it in the careful control of her voice, the deliberate steadiness of her hands. But she had converted it into something operational, fuel rather than fire. "This journal," Caedric said, "if it documents Crown Council ministers participating in a conspiracy to manufacture treason charges using royal resources, it doesn't just expose Malgrim. It indicts the institutional authority behind the siege, which means Malgrim's military authorization was obtained through corrupt channels. The siege isn't a legitimate Crown action. It's a private operation wearing institutional clothing. Can you prove that?" "I can prove that the 2 ministers who co-signed the military authorization received financial transfers from Malgrim's accounts within 30 days of signing. I can prove that the evidence authentication was performed by individuals with documented financial relationships to the accusing parties. And I can prove that the original treason accusation was drafted not by Crown Legal Counsel, but by Lord Varen's personal attorney, which means the man who abused me is using the Crown's machinery to silence me from beyond our reach." She laid the documents on the table in a sequence that told a story. Financial records first, then correspondence, then the journal entries, each one building on the last until the full architecture of the conspiracy was visible. Not a political maneuver, but a criminal enterprise, coordinated across multiple houses and institutional actors, designed to eliminate one woman and punish the man who had protected her. Caedric looked at the evidence, then at Serafina. The armory lamplight caught her face at an angle that showed both the exhaustion and the ferocity, and he understood that what he was seeing was not merely intelligence work. It was an act of survival so fierce it had transcended self-preservation and become something closer to justice. The refusal to let the people who had orchestrated her destruction escape accountability simply because they had wrapped their cruelty in legal language and institutional authority. "If this reaches the right hands," he said, "it doesn't just discredit Malgrim. It gives every soldier in that column a reason to question whether the orders they're following are legitimate." "Exactly. We need to get it out, past the siege line, to someone with enough authority and enough distance from the conspiracy to act on it." "Lord Blackwood," Serafina said immediately. "He sent 150 men. His territory borders the Southern Road. He has direct communication channels to the Crown's Inspector General, who operates independently of the Council ministers. If Blackwood receives this evidence and transmits it through the Inspector General's office, it triggers an independent investigation that supersedes the Council's authority. Blackwood is a practical man. He sent troops because he hates Malgrim, not because he loves justice. He'll need incentive. The journal implicates Lord Caldern in financial fraud unrelated to the conspiracy. Timber rights manipulation that directly damaged Blackwood's Eastern holdings. Give Blackwood the Caldern evidence along with the conspiracy documentation. His personal grievance provides motivation. The conspiracy evidence provides the vehicle. Caedric stared at her. The tactical precision. The layered understanding of human motivation. The ability to weaponize information not through brute exposure, but through strategic distribution to individuals whose self-interest aligned with the desired outcome. You would have made a terrifying politician, he said. I was married to one for 3 years. You learn the mechanics whether you want to or not. You were never married to Varen. Engagement is marriage without the ceremony. The cage is the same size regardless of what you call it. He finished strapping the chest plate. The leather settled against his ribs. 40 pounds of protection that would stop a glancing blade and do nothing against a direct crossbow bolt. The arithmetic of armor. It improved your odds without guaranteeing anything, which was the most honest metaphor for preparation he had ever encountered. I'll send a rider to Blackwood within the hour, he said. The fastest horse we have. If the siege line hasn't fully closed on the western approach, there's still a corridor through the cliff paths. I'm going. The statement dropped into the armory like a stone into still water. No, Caedric said. The writer needs someone who can explain the evidence. Context matters. Numbers on a page don't convict anyone. The narrative connecting them does. I built that narrative. I'm the only person who can present it coherently under time pressure. You're also the person 1,200 soldiers have been authorized to arrest. If you're captured outside these walls, if I stay inside these walls and they fall, I'm captured anyway. Or killed. The difference between dying behind stone and dying in the open is aesthetic, not functional. I am not sending you through a siege line. You're not sending me anywhere. I'm going, with or without your approval. With is faster. Without is harder but still possible, because I've already identified the western cliff path and I've already spoken to your stable master about which horse handles ice. Caedric's hands had stopped moving. He stood in the armory with the chest plate half secured and looked at the woman in front of him and felt the two forces inside him collide with an impact that made his vision narrow. The first force was old, inherited, bone deep. The need to control the variables, protect the asset, keep the thing he valued inside the perimeter where his power could guarantee its safety. His father's voice, the architecture of possession dressed in the language of protection. The second force was new, unfinished, still under construction. The understanding that Seraphina was not an asset to be protected, but a person with agency, capability, and the right to risk her own life for the same cause he was risking his. That denying her that right was not protection. It was the same cage Varen had built, painted a different color. The collision lasted 3 seconds. It felt like 3 years. The western cliff path is ice-covered and unlit, he said. You'll need a guide. Your stable master's nephew knows the route. He's volunteered. You already arranged this. I arranged it while you were briefing the garrison. You were busy. I was thorough. Something that was almost a laugh escaped Caedric's chest. Not amusement. The involuntary sound of a man who had spent his entire life being the most strategic person in every room he occupied, and was now standing across from someone who matched him, move for move, and wasn't even trying to compete. She was simply operating at the level the situation demanded, and the fact that her operations occasionally surpassed his was not a threat to his authority, but a vindication of everything he had risked to protect her. 1 hour, he said. Western gate. Take the evidence, take the horse, take the guide. If the siege line has closed on the western approach, you turn back. No heroics, no improvisation. You come back inside these walls and we find another way. Agreed. Seraphina. She stopped at the door. He wanted to say something. The pressure of it was physical, a weight behind his sternum that demanded expression, that pushed against the disciplined structure of his self-control like water building behind a dam. Words that had been forming since the night on the terrace. Maybe since 7 years before that. Words that belonged to a version of himself he was still becoming, spoken to a woman who was already everything he was learning to be. But the words wouldn't come. Not because he couldn't find them, because the moment was wrong. Declarations made before battles were either promises or goodbyes, and he refused to offer either one. Promises assumed survival. Goodbyes assumed loss. What existed between them required neither assumption. It simply required the next hour, and the hour after that, and every hour they could fight to keep. "Ride fast," he said. She held his eyes for 1 second. Then she was gone. The assault began at midnight. Caedric heard the drums first, a deep rhythmic pounding that traveled through the frozen ground and up through Blackmere's walls like a heartbeat being forced into the stone itself. Crown war drums. The sound designed not for communication, but for psychological erosion, a steady, inescapable reminder that the force outside the walls was organized, numerous, and patient enough to announce itself before it struck. Then the torches appeared, hundreds of them, moving through the darkness in formation. The siege line advancing across the valley floor toward Blackmere's eastern approach. Infantry in front, cavalry behind. The trebuchets being wheeled forward through the snow, their massive wooden arms silhouetted against the torch-lit sky, like skeletal fingers reaching toward the castle. Caedric stood on the eastern wall, chest plate secured, sword at his hip. The field scope pressed against his eye, tracking the advance, reading the formation, measuring distances. "Ram teams approaching the eastern gate," he called to Caedric, who stood 3 paces to his left with a signal torch. 4 groups, 20 men each. Cavalry in column formation behind. They're expecting the gate to open inward. "Crossbow teams ready," Caedric confirmed. "Wall captains are holding for your signal. Hold until the ram makes contact. I want them committed to the approach before we engage. Let them spend the energy. Let them believe the infiltrators are still in position. The longer they believe the gate is about to open, the longer they stay bunched in the kill zone." The column advanced. Caedric counted seconds. His heartbeat was elevated. He could feel it against the inside of the chest plate, a rapid, insistent drumming that his breathing discipline could slow but not silence. Sweat formed along his hairline despite the cold. His hands on the stone parapet were steady, but the steadiness required effort, conscious muscular control overriding the autonomic tremor that combat proximity generated in every human body, regardless of experience or training. Fear. The word his father had spent a lifetime teaching him to reject. But Caedric was done rejecting it. Fear was not weakness. Fear was information. The body's honest assessment that the situation contained genuine threat, delivered through the only communication channel the nervous system possessed. A man who couldn't feel fear was a man whose threat detection systems had failed, and failed systems got people killed. He felt the fear, acknowledged it, used it to sharpen his focus the way a whetstone used friction to sharpen a blade. The fear made his senses acute. The torchlight was brighter. The drum rhythm was clearer. The formation details were more precise, every piece of sensory data arriving with enhanced resolution, because his body understood, at the deepest biological level, that the next 60 minutes would determine whether he continued to exist. The ram teams reached the gate. The first impact shook the eastern wall. A deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the stone and rattled the crossbow stocks mounted along the parapet. The soldiers on the wall felt it through their boots. A second impact. A third. The rhythm was mechanical, coordinated teams swinging the ram with the practiced timing of men who had done this before. Inside the gate corridor, Captain Aldrich's men braced. The gate was reinforced, iron bolts driven through oak planks 6 inches thick, backed by stone supports that Caedric's overnight reconstruction had tripled. It would hold. For now. The cavalry column behind the ram teams was tightening its formation, drawing closer, preparing for the moment. The gate swung inward and the breach corridor opened for mounted assault. Horses stamping in the snow, riders leaning forward. The collective posture of men about to charge through a gap that was about to not exist. "Now," Caedric said. Caedric raised the signal torch. 3 bursts. The wall captains saw it simultaneously. 80 crossbows fired from the eastern wall in a single volley. The sound was unlike anything the crown soldiers below had expected. A massed hiss followed by the staccato percussion of bolts striking metal, wood, flesh, and frozen ground. The ram teams took the first wave. Men dropped. The ram itself was abandoned as survivors scrambled for cover that didn't exist beneath a wall 40 feet high. The cavalry behind them absorbed the second volley. Horses screamed. The formation broke as animals and riders went down in the snow, creating obstacles that the column behind them crashed into with the momentum of a force that had been moving forward and suddenly had nowhere to go. 7 minutes. That was the window. The time between the cavalry's commitment to the approach and their ability to reorganize into an effective assault without the expected internal breach. Caedric used every second. Reload. Concentrated fire on the cavalry mass. Don't let them regroup. The crossbow teams cycled with the efficiency of men who had been drilling since dawn. Load, aim, release. Load, aim, release. Bolts rained into the bottlenecked formation below. The kill zone became exactly what its name implied. A compressed space where superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage because there was nowhere to move, nowhere to hide, and the bolts kept coming from above with the relentless regularity of a machine designed for exactly this purpose. 3 minutes in. The crown formation was fragmenting. Officers were screaming orders that competed with the drums and the crossbow volleys and the sounds of men and horses dying in the snow. The organized advance had collapsed into reactive chaos. Soldiers seeking cover behind fallen horses, ram teams abandoning equipment, cavalry riders trying to turn mounts in a space too compressed for maneuver. 5 minutes. The rear elements of the column were pulling back. The trebuchets had stopped advancing. Their ox teams were turning the heavy equipment around on the frozen road, the operators recognizing that wooden siege engines within crossbow range of an active wall were not assets but targets. 6 minutes. Caedric saw movement on the periphery. A contingent of crown soldiers, perhaps 200, breaking away from the main column and moving laterally along the cliff base toward the northern approach. A flanking attempt, Malgrim adjusting in real time, redirecting forces to probe for weaknesses that his compromised intelligence no longer accurately mapped. Northern wall, Caedric said to Heydrich. 200 moving along the cliff base. Tell Vance to shift his reserve crossbows to the northern parapet. I want them pinned against the cliff with nowhere to climb. Heydrich dispatched the runner. The order traveled through the castle's communication chain, runners sprinting through corridors, signals passing between wall sections. The human infrastructure of command performing at the speed trust allowed. Not the speed of fear-driven compliance, the speed of men who had been briefed, who understood the plan, who had been trusted with context and were now operating within it with the initiative that context provided. 7 minutes. The window closed. The crown column pulled back. Not a retreat, a reorganization. They withdrew beyond crossbow range and began reforming, officers restoring order to units that had been savaged by 7 minutes of concentrated fire from an elevation they hadn't been prepared to face without the expected internal breach. The eastern approach was littered with bodies. Dead horses. Abandoned equipment. The snow had turned dark in patches that were visible even in torchlight. The first assault had cost Malgrim somewhere between 80 and 100 men and accomplished nothing except confirming that Blackmere's gates were not going to open from inside. On the wall, Caedric allowed himself 10 seconds. 10 seconds to breathe, to feel the sweat cooling on his skin beneath the chest plate, to register the tremor in his hands now that the immediate crisis had passed and his body was processing the adrenaline backwash that followed sustained combat stress. His shoulders ached from tension he hadn't noticed maintaining. His jaw was sore from clenching. The physical toll of 7 minutes at maximum intensity, paid in the currency of muscle fiber and nervous system bandwidth. 10 seconds. Then the calculations resumed. Malgrim would adapt. The second assault would not repeat the first approach. The trebuchets would be brought forward under shield cover. The flanking probes would intensify. And somewhere in the Crown Commander's tent, the realization was forming that this siege would not be the quick, politically convenient demonstration of force Malgrim had promised. It would be an actual war, fought against defenders who were prepared, positioned, and led by a man who had no intention of making it easy. The cost of that realization would be measured in days. Days of siege, days of attrition, days of stone and steel, and the grinding mathematics of supply versus demand, ammunition versus bodies, endurance versus the specific kind of exhaustion that accumulated in men who spent every hour of every day knowing that the next assault could be the one that breached the wall. But somewhere beyond the siege line, riding through frozen darkness on a path along the western cliffs, a woman was carrying evidence that could end this war without another drop of blood. If she made it through. Caedric didn't allow himself to think about the if, because the if was a door that opened onto a room he could not enter and still function. The room where Seraphina's horse lost footing on the ice. The room where a crown patrol spotted movement on the cliff path. The room where the evidence never reached Blackwood. And the siege continued until the walls fell, or the supplies ran out, or the remaining allies calculated that loyalty to a besieged duke was a losing investment and quietly switched sides. He closed the door, locked it, stood on the wall above his damaged fortress, and his bloodied soldiers, and his frozen kingdom, and made the decision that separated the living from the dead in every conflict ever fought. He chose to believe she would make it, not because the evidence supported optimism, because the alternative was despair, and despair was a luxury that the 600 men behind these walls could not afford their commander to indulge. The second assault came 4 hours later, different approach. The trebuchets advanced under mobile shield walls, wooden barricades pushed forward by infantry teams, absorbing crossbow bolts while the heavy equipment rolled into operational range behind them. Malgrim had learned from the first attempt. The formation was dispersed, the cavalry held in reserve. The advance was methodical rather than aggressive, sacrificing speed for survivability. The first trebuchet stone hit Blackmere's eastern wall at dawn. The impact was seismic. 40 pounds of shaped granite traveling at terminal velocity, striking the outer wall surface with a sound that wasn't a crash but a detonation. Stone against stone, the fundamental collision of siege warfare, felt through every floor of the castle, from battlement to cellar. Dust erupted from the wall surface. Cracks propagated through the mortar lines. The soldiers on the parapet staggered. A second stone. Different section. The trebuchets were ranging, walking their fire across the wall face, testing for structural weaknesses, probing for the point where 300 years of masonry would yield to the mathematics of kinetic energy applied with sufficient repetition. "Get the oil moving," Caedric ordered. The drainage channels along the eastern wall were already primed. 40 barrels of lamp oil distributed through a gravity-fed system that Hadric's engineers had constructed overnight, using the castle's existing rainwater infrastructure. The oil would flow downhill through channels cut into the wall's exterior face, pooling at the base where the trebuchets were positioned. All it needed was a spark. A third stone struck. This one found a seam. A section of the parapet 3 feet wide shifted, cracked, and partially collapsed outward, sending a cascade of rubble down the wall face. 2 crossbowmen fell with it. One caught the wall walk railing, the other disappeared over the edge without a sound. Caedric felt it. The death. Not sentimentally, physically. A contraction in his chest that had nothing to do with the impact and everything to do with the understanding that a man who had been alive 30 seconds ago, a man whose name Caedric had learned that morning, whose face he could still see in his memory, was now broken on the rocks below because of a decision Caedric had made to stand and fight instead of surrender. The weight of command. Not the weight of authority. The weight of consequence. Every soldier on this wall was here because Caedric had chosen to defy the crown. Every injury, every death, every family that would receive word that their son or husband or father was not coming home, all of it traceable to one man's decision to value one woman's life above the political order that would have consumed her. Was it worth it? The question surfaced like a blade through water, sudden, sharp, impossible to ignore. He let it cut. Let it open the doubt that lived beneath every decision he had made since the night he burned the Ashworth letter. And in the wound, he found the answer. Not in logic, not in philosophy, in the faces of the men on the wall. The soldiers who had been briefed, who understood what they were fighting for, who had chosen to stay when the gates were open and the option to leave was real. They had not stayed because Caedric commanded it. They had stayed because something in the briefing, the honesty, the respect, the unprecedented act of a Draven Duke treating common soldiers as participants rather than instruments, had given them a reason that transcended obedience. They were fighting for the principle that loyalty meant something, that protection meant something, that a man who stood for someone weaker against something stronger was worth following even when the odds said otherwise. Caedric had never given anyone that reason before. He had given orders, issued threats, maintained the machinery of fear that kept the duchy functional. But he had never given anyone a reason to fight that was worth dying for, because reasons required vulnerability, and vulnerability required the admission that something mattered enough to lose. Everything mattered now: the walls, the men, the woman on a horse somewhere in the frozen dark. And because everything mattered, everything was at risk. "Release the oil," Caedric said. The valves opened. Lamp oil cascaded down the eastern wall face in dark rivulets, flowing through the drainage channels, pooling at the base where the trebuchets stood behind their shield walls. The advancing infantry didn't notice immediately. The oil was dark against dark stone, visible only where torchlight caught the liquid sheen. Then a crossbowman on the parapet fired a bolt wrapped in burning pitch. The wall base ignited. The fire spread along the oil channels with the speed of something alive, a racing line of orange and white that traced the drainage paths down the wall face and exploded outward across the ground where the oil had pooled. The trebuchets caught instantly. 3 massive wooden siege engines transformed from weapons into pyres in under 30 seconds, their frames consumed by flames that roared upward into the pre-dawn sky with a sound like the atmosphere itself was tearing. The shield walls ignited next. Infantry scattered. The organized advance dissolved into chaos as men fled burning equipment and burning ground, their formation breaking apart in every direction. The disciplined siege approach reduced to survival, level scrambling as fire consumed the tactical infrastructure Malgrim had spent hours positioning. From the wall, Caedric watched the fire. His face was lit orange. His eyes reflected the flames. Somewhere beneath the chest plate, his heart was beating at a rate that exceeded any tactical rationale. Not from fear, not from exertion, but from the specific, terrifying clarity that comes when a man understands he has crossed every line that defined his former life and is now standing in territory that has no map. The fire burned. The crown column retreated beyond range. The eastern approach was impassable, a field of flames and burning wreckage that would take hours to clear. Blackmere had survived the second assault, but the walls were cracked, the parapet was damaged, ammunition was depleting, and the crown column, despite its losses, still outnumbered the garrison by nearly 2 to 1. Caedric descended from the wall. His legs were unsteady in a way he would never allow anyone to see. He reached the interior corridor and leaned against the stone, one hand pressed to the wall, his breathing ragged, his body demanding rest that the situation would not permit. Caedric found him there. "Blackwood's territory is 12 hours by the cliff path," Caedric said. "If she left on schedule, she's approximately halfway." Approximately. "The siege can hold for 2 days on current supplies, 3 if we ration aggressively. After that, attrition favors the attackers regardless of wall integrity." 2 days. Serafina needed 12 hours to reach Blackwood. Blackwood needed time to authenticate the evidence, contact the Inspector General, and initiate the process that would delegitimize the siege. Time that Blackmere might not have. "Then we make 2 days feel like a year," Caedric said. "Every assault costs them. Every hour costs them. We make the price so high that Malgrim's officers start calculating whether the man giving them orders is worth the men they're losing." He pushed himself off the wall, straightened, forced the exhaustion below the surface where it couldn't contaminate the command presence his men needed to see. And then a runner appeared at the end of the corridor. Young, breathing hard, his face carrying the expression that Caedric had learned to read the way sailors read storm warnings. The specific, unmistakable look of someone carrying news that changes everything. "Your Grace," the runner's voice cracked. "The Western Watch reports a signal fire on the cliff ridge, 3 bursts. The code is 3 bursts is the Draven arrival signal," Caedric said. His voice had changed, something moving beneath the professional control. "Someone is coming, from the west." Caedric moved. Through the corridor, up the western staircase. 2 flights. 3. His lungs burning from the climb, his legs protesting the speed after hours of standing on the wall. He reached the western parapet and pressed the field scope to his eye and aimed it at the cliff ridge above the sea. Dawn was breaking, gray light bleeding across the frozen water. The cliff path was visible as a thin line scratched across the rock face, barely wide enough for a horse, coated in ice. And on that path, emerging from the shadow of the ridge, was a column of riders. Not one, Not 3. 50. At the front, mounted on a gray horse that picked its way along the ice, with the careful precision of an animal bred for mountain terrain, rode a woman in a leather vest with a braid pulled back from a face that showed 12 hours of hard riding and 0 hours of rest. Beside her, under a banner Caedric recognized immediately, rode Lord Blackwood himself. And behind them, stretching back along the cliff path in a line that disappeared around the ridge, were soldiers. Blackwood's soldiers. Not 50. Hundreds. An advancing column of reinforcements approaching Blackmere from the one direction Malgrim's siege line had left uncovered, because no commander in recorded history had been insane enough to move an army along a frozen cliff path above the northern sea in winter. Caedric lowered the scope. His hands were shaking. Not from cold, not from exhaustion, from something he did not have a name for yet because it belonged to the man he was still becoming. The man who had chosen vulnerability over fortification and was now watching the result ride toward him along an impossible path. She had made it. She had made it, and she had brought an army. And far below the western cliffs, visible through the dawn light, the crown siege line was beginning to notice the signal fires on the ridge. Officers were pointing, cavalry units were turning. The disciplined perimeter that had strangled Blackmere from the east was suddenly, catastrophically, facing a threat from the direction it had never bothered to guard. Caedric gripped the parapet. The stone was cold beneath his fingers. The dawn was breaking. The fire on the eastern approach was still burning. And somewhere in the space between the walls he stood on and the woman riding toward them, the war for Blackmere was about to enter its final hour. Blackwood's column reached the western gate in under an hour. 400 soldiers. Heavy northern infantry armed for winter combat, fur-lined steel, thick shields, short swords designed for close-quarters work in confined spaces. They filed through the gate in disciplined ranks, filling the western courtyard with the sound of boots on frozen stone and the metallic rhythm of armed men moving with purpose. Behind them came supply wagons, grain, ammunition, medical provisions. The practical infrastructure of a lord who hadn't sent a gesture of support, but an operational commitment. Caedric met Blackwood in the inner courtyard. The northern lord dismounted with the stiff movements of a man in his late 50s who had spent 12 hours on horseback in freezing conditions and refused to acknowledge the physical cost. Tall, broad-shouldered, a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the cliffs his territory occupied, weathered, angular, permanently set in an expression that suggested smiling was something other people did. 400 men, Caedric said. I asked for 150. You asked for 150 before your woman showed up at my gates with a satchel of documents that prove half the Crown Council is running a criminal enterprise. Blackwood pulled off his riding gloves finger by finger. I sent 150 for the Malgrim problem. The additional 250 are for the institutional corruption problem, which is significantly larger and significantly more interesting. The Inspector General. Dispatched the evidence by fast courier before we departed. My personal seal and sworn testimony attached. The Inspector General is an ambitious man with a clean reputation who has been looking for exactly this kind of case to establish his authority independent of the council. He'll move fast, maybe 48 hours before formal proceedings begin. 48 hours is a long time when 1,200 soldiers are throwing rocks at your walls, which is why I brought 400 men instead of a letter of support. Blackwood looked at the cracked eastern wall, the smoke still rising from the burned trebuchets, the debris scattered across the approach. You've been busy. It's been a long night, Blackwood grunted. The sound conveyed approximately 7 different assessments, none of them sentimental. Your woman, the Veil Girl. Lady Seraphina. She rode 12 hours on an ice-covered cliff path in the dark, talked her way into my war room, laid out a case against 6 noble houses and 2 crown ministers with the precision of a trained prosecutor, and then insisted on riding back with my column instead of staying where it was safe. Blackwood looked at Caedric with an expression that combined grudging respect with something closer to incredulity. Where the hell did you find her? She found me. That tracks. Women like that don't get found. They show up and the geography rearranges itself. Seraphina appeared at the courtyard entrance. She was still mounted, her horse being led by the stablemaster's nephew, a boy of 16 who looked simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated, the expression of someone who had just participated in something they would spend the rest of their life telling people about. She dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose muscles had seized during 12 hours of frozen riding and were now protesting the return to vertical operation. Caedric walked to her. The courtyard was full of soldiers, Blackwood's men mixing with the garrison, officers exchanging information, supply wagons being unloaded, the organized chaos of reinforcement integration. None of it mattered, none of it registered. The entire operational universe contracted to the space between him and the woman standing beside a gray horse with ice in her braid and road dirt on her face, and the look of someone who had ridden through the worst night of her life and come back carrying salvation in a leather satchel. He stopped in front of her, close, the same distance as the night on the terrace, when the wind had howled and the frozen sea had stretched beneath them, and neither of them had known what was coming. "You made it," he said. "I made it. You brought an army. I brought a practical man with a grudge and enough soldiers to make the grudge operational. The army part was his idea." He looked at her. The exhaustion was real, visible in the shadows beneath her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her weight shifted as her body negotiated the competing demands of adrenaline depletion and sheer physical fatigue. But beneath the exhaustion, something else was burning. The same fierce, unquenchable vitality he had first recognized 7 years ago in his father's banquet hall. The quality that had nothing to do with beauty or charm or social performance, and everything to do with the simple, devastating fact that Seraphina Vale was a person who refused to be consumed by the circumstances that should have destroyed her. He reached out and took her hand. Not the grip of the war room pact, urgent, desperate, sealed under the pressure of approaching catastrophe. Something different, slower, his thumb against her knuckle. The deliberate, unhurried touch of a man who had spent his entire life avoiding contact and was now choosing it in front of 400 witnesses, because he was done hiding the things that mattered behind the architecture of control. Seraphina looked at their hands, then at his face. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the quiet, seismic quality of a fault line adjusting to new pressure. Recognition, acceptance. The understanding that the man holding her hand in a courtyard full of soldiers was not the same man who had burned a letter in a dark study 9 days ago, and that the distance between those two men was measured not in time, but in the things he had been willing to lose. "You're shaking," she said. "I've been awake for 36 hours. "That's not why you're shaking." "No, it's not." She squeezed his hand, once, then released it and turned toward the castle entrance with the practical efficiency of a woman who understood that emotional resolution, however necessary, could not precede operational completion. There was still a siege, there was still an army, there was still a war that needed ending, but the squeeze said everything that the moment couldn't contain. Later. When this is done. When the walls are quiet and the fires are out and the world has stopped trying to tear us apart. Later, we finish this conversation. Caedric watched her walk inside. Then he turned to Blackwood, who had observed the entire exchange with the impassive expression of a man who had been married for 30 years and understood exactly what he was witnessing. "The eastern wall needs shoring," Caedric said. "My engineers are already assessing it. And Malgrim's siege line needs to know the numbers have changed. I suggest we tell them loudly." They told them at noon. Blackwood's 400 soldiers deployed along Blackmere's walls, in full view of the Crown siege line. The effect was immediate and devastating, not because 400 men fundamentally altered the military mathematics, though they did, but because their presence communicated something that no amount of tactical calculation could counteract. Blackmere was not isolated. The Northern Lords had not abandoned the Duke, and the assumption that Malgrim's siege would face a diminishing garrison trapped behind crumbling walls was no longer operative. The Crown Column's response was visible through the field scope, officers in urgent conference, cavalry units repositioning, the organized confidence of the morning assault replaced by the reactive uncertainty of a force confronting variables its planning hadn't accounted for. Malgrim had designed the siege around isolation, cut Blackmere off, let attrition do the work, wait for the walls to crack, and the garrison to starve. None of that functioned when reinforcements arrived from an approach the siege line hadn't covered, and the defenders' numbers jumped by 60% in a single morning. By early afternoon, a crown rider approached under a flag of parley. Caedric received him in the outer courtyard. Not the council chamber, not the throne room, the open air, surrounded by soldiers, with the cracked eastern wall visible behind him, as evidence of what the morning had cost, and Blackwood's fresh troops visible on every parapet as evidence of what the afternoon had provided. The rider was a Crown military adjutant, a professional officer with no personal investment in the political conflict, dispatched to deliver terms the way postal carriers delivered letters. He presented the message with the neutral efficiency of a man performing a function. Malgrim's revised terms. Withdrawal of the treason accusation in exchange for Seraphina's voluntary exile from Valadorn. Restoration of Crown-Draven relations. Mutual agreement to consider the matter resolved. Caedric read the terms. The adjutant waited. Voluntary exile, Caedric said. Meaning she disappears again. Meaning the evidence of what Varen did to her gets buried under a diplomatic agreement. Meaning the institutional corruption that manufactured the accusation continues to operate because no one with enough power to expose it had enough courage to insist. The adjutant said nothing. His function was delivery, not debate. Take this response back to Lord Malgrim. Caedric folded the terms and handed them back to the rider. Tell him that in approximately 48 hours, the Crown's Inspector General will receive documented evidence of criminal conspiracy involving 2 council ministers, 4 noble houses, and the fraudulent use of royal authority to manufacture treason charges against an innocent woman. Tell him that Lord Blackwood's sworn testimony accompanies that evidence. Tell him that every hour his soldiers remain deployed against Blackmere's walls is another hour of military expenditure against a position he cannot take, in service of an operation that is about to be formally declared illegitimate by the kingdom's own oversight authority. He paused. Let the adjutant absorb the scope of what was being communicated. And tell him that if he wants to discuss surrender, I'll be available after dinner. The rider departed. The parley flag retreated across the frozen valley toward the Crown siege line, where Malgrim was about to receive the first indication that his conspiracy had not merely been resisted but disassembled, and that the woman he had tried to destroy had been the one to carry the evidence that would destroy him. The siege dissolved over the next 36 hours, not with a dramatic collapse, not with a single decisive moment that the storytellers could later identify as the turning point, with the slow, grinding, anticlimactic erosion of a military operation losing its institutional support, one piece at a time. The first fracture came at dusk on the first day when House Montague's contingent withdrew from the siege line without authorization. 200 soldiers packing equipment and marching south along the main road. Their departure visible from Blackmere's walls as a column of torchlight moving away from the siege perimeter like a retreating bloodline. Montague had calculated the odds and decided that continued association with a conspiracy about to be exposed was a liability his house could not afford. The second fracture came overnight, when the Crown military commander, a career officer named General Thorn, who had accepted the siege assignment as a legitimate Crown action and was now beginning to suspect it was neither, requested a private meeting with Lord Blackwood through back-channel intermediaries. The meeting occurred at dawn on the second day, in a neutral location between the lines. What was said remained between the two men, but Thorn returned to the Crown position and immediately ordered the trebuchets dismantled. The third fracture, the fatal one, came 40 hours after the adjutant's visit, when a rider bearing the Inspector General's seal arrived at the Crown siege line, carrying formal orders to suspend all military operations pending investigation of the authorizing council ministers. The orders were addressed to General Thorn, not to Malgrim, which communicated with bureaucratic precision exactly whose authority the Crown's oversight body recognized and whose it did not. Malgrim attempted to countermand the orders. Thorn refused. The exchange occurred in view of the entire siege line, and while the exact words were inaudible from Blackmere's walls, the body language was unmistakable. 2 men standing face to face, one insisting and one refusing, and the 1,200 soldiers watching them understood with the collective instinct of men who had spent their careers reading power dynamics that authority had just changed hands. By evening of the second day, the Crown column was withdrawing. Organized, disciplined, not a rout but a controlled retreat, units pulling back along the roads they had advanced on, the machinery of siege warfare disassembling itself with the same methodical precision it had used to assemble. The trebuchet wreckage was left behind. Burned timbers and twisted metal scattered across the eastern approach, like the skeleton of an ambition that had overestimated its own structural integrity. Malgrim departed with the rearguard. His personal banner, the silver serpent on a crimson field, was the last to disappear down the southern road. Caedric watched it from the eastern wall through the field scope until it vanished into the tree line, and he kept watching for several minutes after it was gone. Not because he expected it to return, because he was registering the specific sensation of a threat that had consumed his existence for weeks, finally receding beyond the horizon, and the absence it left behind felt less like relief and more like the strange, hollow quiet that follows a sustained explosion. The world still ringing, the ears still adjusting, the nervous system still braced for an impact that was no longer coming. Caedric found him on the wall. The advisor carried no dispatches, no intelligence reports, no urgent operational updates requiring immediate decision. He simply stood beside the Duke on the eastern parapet as the last of the daylight faded and the frozen valley below them returned to the empty, windswept landscape. It had been before 1,200 soldiers had tried to turn it into a graveyard. Casualties, Caedric said, 14 dead, 31 wounded, 6 of the wounded critical, but the medical team is confident in recovery for 4 of the 6. 14 dead. 14 men who had been alive 3 days ago, who had eaten in the mess hall and sharpened blades and pulled watch duty in the freezing wind because a duke had asked them to hold a wall. 14 families who would receive word that the person they were waiting for was not coming home. 14 names that Caedric now knew because he had walked the walls and learned them, and the knowing made each number a specific individual weight that pressed against his chest with a gravity no tactical victory could offset. Their families receive full death stipends, Caedric said, triple the standard rate, and their names go on the memorial wall in the Great Hall, not the Garrison Memorial, the main hall, where every noble who walks through those doors has to see them. Caedric nodded. He didn't comment on the departure from protocol. Noble memorials in the Great Hall were reserved for lords and officers. Common soldiers were commemorated in garrison spaces that no one of rank ever visited. The hierarchy of remembrance, like every other hierarchy in Valadorn, was designed to reinforce the distinction between the people who made decisions and the people who paid for them. Caedric was done with that distinction. The Marchioness, he said, still detained, cooperative. She's provided additional documentation that corroborates everything in her journal. The Inspector General's office has requested her testimony as part of the formal investigation. Release her to their custody when they send for her. She'll face whatever the investigation produces. I don't need to add my judgment to it. And Malgrim? Malgrim is the Inspector General's problem now. The evidence Serafina delivered to Blackwood is comprehensive enough to dismantle his coalition, and the financial trail connects directly to the council ministers who authorized the siege. The institutional response will be slower than what I'd prefer, but it will be more thorough than anything I could accomplish through force. He paused, looked at the valley. The snow was untouched again where the siege line had been, the evidence of 1,200 men already disappearing beneath fresh accumulation, the landscape forgetting, the stone remembering. Caedric, my lord, 20 years you've served this house. 22, but who count? In those 22 years, did you ever believe I was capable of what happened in that council chamber? When I pulled out the evidence, when I chose to fight instead of comply. Caedric was quiet for a long time. The wind moved across the parapet. Below them, soldiers were beginning the work of cleaning the eastern approach, removing debris, clearing the burned trebuchet wreckage, restoring the ground to something that didn't look like a battlefield. The work of recovery. Less dramatic than the work of war, but infinitely more important, because anyone could destroy a thing, but only certain people could rebuild it afterward. I believed you were capable of it, Caedric said finally. What I didn't believe was that you would choose it. Your father was capable of many things he never chose. Capability without willingness is just potential energy sitting in a dark room. You chose to open the door. That's the part I didn't predict. You disapproved. I was terrified. There's a difference. Disapproval is a judgment. Terror is a response to watching someone you've spent 2 decades trying to keep alive deliberately walk toward the most dangerous thing they've ever faced. Caedric looked at him. 22 years of proximity in that gaze. The accumulated understanding of a man who had watched a boy become a duke, become a weapon, become something the architecture was never designed to produce. I was terrified because you were right. And being right in that situation meant the stakes were real, which meant the consequences were real, which meant the man I had spent my career advising was genuinely at risk of losing everything, including his life. Were you prepared for that? I stood behind you in the chamber. I rebuilt the defense plan overnight. I managed the garrison deployment during the siege. What do you think? I think I never asked whether you wanted to. I assumed your service and took your loyalty for granted. The same way I took every other structural element of this duchy for granted. Because that's what my father taught me. That people in positions of service are functions, not individuals, and their compliance is the natural state that doesn't require acknowledgement. Caedric said nothing for a moment. Then he did something Caedric had never seen in 22 years of partnership. He smiled. Not a large smile. Not a warm one. The smile of a man receiving something he had stopped expecting so long ago that the receipt itself was almost disorienting. You're a slow learner, my lord, but you're thorough. I'd like to think that's the Draven way. The Draven way is conquering things and refusing to admit feelings exist. What you're doing is something else entirely. I don't think there's a name for it yet. They stood together on the wall as the last light disappeared. Two men who had survived something that should have broken everything between them and had instead, through the particular alchemy of crisis and honesty, discovered that the structure of their relationship was not the formal hierarchy they had both assumed it to be, but something more resilient and more human. Not lord and advisor, partners, different in rank, equal in the investment that had kept them both standing when the walls shook. The days that followed moved at a different speed. The court reconvened. The remaining winter court guests emerged from whatever psychological shelters they had constructed during the siege and resumed the business of aristocratic life with the brittle energy of people pretending that the world they had just witnessed nearly collapse was fundamentally stable. Conversations restarted. Negotiations resumed. The social machinery of noble society cranked back into motion with the determined normalcy of an institution that survived by refusing to acknowledge how close it had come to not surviving. But the court had changed, the hierarchy of silence that had governed Blackmere for decades, the unspoken understanding that the Duke's authority was mechanical, impersonal, and not to be tested, had been replaced by something more complicated. Caedric moved through the same halls, occupied the same chambers, conducted the same administrative functions. But the man performing them was visibly different, and the court responded to the difference with a mixture of wariness and something that resembled, in certain lights, respect. Not the old respect, not the careful deference generated by fear of consequences, something newer, less comfortable. The recognition that the man on the ducal platform had placed everything he possessed on the line for a principle. The aristocracy had been taught to consider weakness, and had won not despite the vulnerability, but because of it. The allies who had stood with him, Blackwood, the garrison, the soldiers who held the walls, had stood because he had given them something his father never had. Honesty, context, the acknowledgement that their contribution mattered, and their judgment was valued. The court didn't understand it, not fully. The aristocracy was a system optimized for transactional relationships, and the concept of authority derived from genuine human investment rather than institutional leverage was foreign enough to generate confusion. But they observed the result. The garrison's morale, the northern lords' strengthened loyalty. The way common soldiers straightened when Caedric walked the walls. Not the mechanical snap to attention of men performing obedience, but the organic posture adjustment of men who felt seen by the person commanding them. The formal proceedings unfolded over weeks. The Inspector General's investigation expanded beyond Malgrim to encompass the network Seraphina's evidence had exposed. Financial corruption, abuse of royal authority, the systematic concealment of Lord Varen's violence against a woman the aristocracy had been socially obligated to protect. 2 council ministers were suspended pending tribunal. House Caldern's lord was summoned for testimony regarding financial fraud. Lord Varen himself, insulated by distance and southern political alliances, faced formal accusations that would follow him for years, the institutional consequences arriving slowly, but arriving nonetheless, with the inexorable patience of a system that had been shown evidence it could not ignore. Malgrim was stripped of his eastern provinces. The official charge was misuse of crown authority. The unofficial understanding was simpler. A man had overplayed his hand, and the kingdom's corrective mechanisms had engaged with the precise, impersonal efficiency that institutions applied to individuals who threatened institutional stability. Malgrim would survive. Men of his class always survived. But his power was broken, his coalition dismantled, and the name that had commanded fear across 4 provinces now commanded nothing except the quiet, devastating pity the aristocracy reserved for ambitious men who had failed publicly. The Crown formally recognized Serafina's innocence in a document bearing the Inspector General's seal and countersigned by the remaining council members. The treason accusation was vacated. The forged evidence was entered into the official record as fabricated. Her name was cleared with the bureaucratic thoroughness that the same system had used to soil it, which carried its own bitter irony, the machinery of institutional authority, performing justice with the same mechanical precision it had previously used to manufacture injustice. Serafina received the document in Blackmere's library. She read it once, set it on the table beside the intelligence files she had spent the siege organizing. Then she looked out the window at the frozen sea and said nothing for a long time. Caedric found her there an hour later. The library fire had burned low. The winter light through the window turned the room silver gray. She was sitting in the chair beside the reading table, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carrying the specific quality of someone who had received everything they had been fighting for and was now confronting the strange emptiness that follows the completion of a consuming purpose. He sat in the chair across from her, said nothing, gave her the space the moment required, the same space he had given her in this room. When the Marchioness's betrayal had landed, the understanding that some things needed to be processed in proximity to another person, but not under the pressure of their expectations. "I thought it would feel different," she said eventually. Her voice was quiet, not defeated, contemplative. The voice of someone examining their own response to a milestone and finding it more complicated than anticipated. The vindication. The official acknowledgement that I wasn't what they said I was. I thought it would feel like something resolving, like a wound closing. And instead it feels like a document on a table, paper and ink and bureaucratic language that doesn't know my name even though it contains it. The same system that tried to destroy me is now officially apologizing, and the apology is formatted in the same font as the accusation, and I can't tell whether that's justice or just administration. Maybe there's no difference. Maybe there isn't. Maybe justice is just administration that happens to land on the right side, and the machinery doesn't care which direction it runs as long as someone provides the input. She looked at him. Is that cynical? It's accurate. Cynicism would be concluding that the accuracy makes the outcome meaningless. The system is mechanical. The people inside it aren't. Blackwood rode 12 hours in freezing darkness because the evidence you presented him was strong enough to override his political caution. The Inspector General moved faster than any institutional process in Valadorn's history because the case you built was so comprehensive that inaction would have been more politically costly than action. The machinery responded because you gave it the right input. That's not administration. That's a woman who survived something terrible and then converted her survival into a lever long enough to move an institution. Serafina studied him. The same direct, unarmored gaze that had crossed a banquet hall 7 years ago and found him beneath the title and the reputation and the fortress made of fear. The gaze that had started everything. "When did you learn to say things like that?" she said. "Recently. I had a good teacher." "I didn't teach you anything. You taught me that the walls I built to protect myself were the same walls preventing anything worth protecting from getting in. You taught me that control is not the same as strength, and that the willingness to be reached by another person is not a vulnerability to be managed, but a capacity to be developed. You taught me those things not by lecturing me about them, but by standing in front of me and refusing to pretend that the version of myself I showed the world was the version that mattered." The words came without strategic calculation, without rhetorical architecture, without the careful positioning that had characterized every significant statement he had made in his adult life. Just truth, unedited, the kind of raw, unprocessed honesty that his father's design had been specifically engineered to prevent, delivered in a library overlooking a frozen sea to the only person who had ever made the engineering feel like captivity rather than protection. Serafina's expression shifted. The contemplative distance that had characterized the last hour softened into something more present, more immediate. Not warmth exactly, something more substantial. The look of a woman who had spent years being lied to by people she trusted and was now receiving honesty from a man she had every reason to distrust, and finding the honesty not just believable, but necessary. The thing she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. She reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand on his. The same touch as the courtyard, deliberate, unhurried, But this time it carried the weight of everything that had happened between then and now. The siege, the betrayals, the wall that burned, and the army that arrived, and the 14 men whose names were being carved into the Great Hall Memorial at this very moment. "I'm going to stay," she said. "I know. Not because you're protecting me. Not because Blackmere is safe, because I choose to. Because the person I am when I'm standing next to you is closer to the person I actually am than any version of myself I've been able to access alone. And because you need someone in this castle who will tell you the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient. And I seem to be the only candidate with the relevant qualifications and the necessary stubbornness. The relevant qualifications being complete imperviousness to your intimidation tactics, and a historically demonstrated willingness to argue with you in your own corridors at unreasonable hours." He almost laughed. The sound caught in his chest and transformed into something else. Not amusement, but release. The specific physical sensation of tension that had been accumulating for weeks finally finding an exit. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched. The armor he wore, not the chest plate which was hanging in the armory, but the invisible architecture of vigilance and control that he had maintained every waking moment since the siege began, shifted and loosened, and for the first time in his adult life did not immediately reassert itself. He turned his hand beneath hers so that their palms aligned. Finger against finger. The contact point between two people who had fought their way through an impossible situation and arrived on the other side, not unscathed but intact, not unchanged but recognizable, carrying the scars of the journey in places that would take years to fully map. "Duchess of Blackmere," he said quietly, "if you'll have the title." Seraphina's breath caught, a small sound, almost inaudible. The involuntary response of someone receiving an offer they had not expected, and finding it more significant than any political maneuver or institutional document, because it came without conditions, without strategic calculus, without the elaborate framework of obligation that characterized every other transaction in their world. "Is that a proposal or a political appointment?" she asked. "Both, neither. It's a man asking a woman to build something with him that neither of them knows how to build, using materials neither of them was taught to use, in a place where every previous attempt at construction has been based on fear and control and the systematic avoidance of anything that might make the builder feel something they couldn't manage. That's the worst proposal in the history of Valadorn." "I know. I'm working with limited experience." She squeezed his hand. Her eyes were bright. Not tears exactly. The luminosity that occurs when emotional pressure exceeds the capacity of composure and the excess escapes through whatever channel is available. She blinked once. Controlled it. Let it stay visible, rather than forcing it underground. "Yes," she said. "To the title, to the construction project, to the complete structural renovation of a man who was built to be a fortress and is now volunteering to install windows." "Yes." He leaned forward, slowly, giving her every opportunity to redirect, to qualify, to maintain the distance that had protected both of them for so long. She didn't move. He pressed his forehead against hers. The contact was minimal, skin against skin, but the intimacy of it was total. Two people sharing the same breath in a room where the fire had gone to embers and the winter light was fading and the world outside the windows was frozen and scarred and slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to thaw. They stayed that way for a long time, not speaking, not needing to. The ceremony occurred 3 weeks later, small, private by aristocratic standards, 50 guests rather than the 300 that tradition demanded. Blackwood attended. Caedric stood at the Duke's right hand. Captain Aldrich, promoted to commander of the Blackmere garrison, attended in formal dress that fit him the way formal dress fits men who are built for armor instead. The 14 names on the Great Hall memorial wall watched from carved stone as the Duke of Blackmere took Seraphina Vale's hand and spoke the words that made her his equal in title, in authority, and in the governance of the northern provinces. The aristocracy received the news with the predictable mixture of outrage, fascination, and grudging acknowledgement that characterized their response to anything that disrupted the established order while simultaneously proving too powerful to resist. Some called it weakness. Others called it sentiment. A few, the ones who had watched closely enough to understand what had actually happened inside Blackmere's walls, called it something else. Evolution. The recognition that the most feared man in the kingdom had not been softened or diminished by what he had endured, but fundamentally rebuilt. The same raw materials reorganized around a different principle, the same power redirected through a different architecture, producing something that was in many ways more formidable than the original because it was sustainable in ways that fear-based authority never could be. Fear required constant maintenance. Trust, once established, maintained itself. That night, long after the ceremony ended and the guests retired and Blackmere settled into the deep quiet of a castle at peace, for the first time in a month, Caedric stood in the private study where he had burned the Ashworth letter. The same room, the same window overlooking the northern sea, the same chair beside the hearth where he had sat alone in the dark and read Seraphina's name and felt the first tremor of the earthquake that had since reorganized his entire existence. The fire was lit this time. The room was warm, and the chair beside the hearth was no longer empty. Seraphina sat with her legs pulled beneath her, a book open in her lap, reading by firelight, with the comfortable absorption of someone who is not performing domesticity, but inhabiting it. She had changed from the ceremony dress into a simple wool tunic. Her hair was loose. The firelight moved across her face in patterns that changed with each shift of the flames, and Caedric watched those patterns from the doorway and felt the thing he had been circling for weeks finally arrive in his chest, with the quiet, absolute certainty of something that had always been there waiting for him to stop running long enough to notice it. He walked to the hearth, sat in the chair beside hers. The leather creaked beneath his weight. The fire popped. Outside, the frozen sea stretched toward a horizon that was invisible in the darkness, and for the first time in his life, the invisibility did not feel like a threat. It felt like possibility. The understanding that what lay beyond the visible edge was not necessarily hostile, that the future was not an approaching enemy, but an unwritten space that could contain things his father's architecture had never imagined. "You're staring," Seraphina said without looking up from her book. "I'm adjusting." "To what?" "To the concept that the most dangerous thing I've ever done is also the most sustainable. Every other decision I've made in my career had a half-life. Alliances decayed. Conquests required maintenance. Fear needed constant reinforcement. This is the first thing I've built that doesn't require me to keep it alive through force." She looked up. The firelight caught her eyes. "Are you going to get philosophical every evening, or is this a special occasion?" "I haven't decided yet. The philosophical capacity is new. I'm still testing its operational parameters." "Well, for what it's worth, the observation is accurate. Fear is expensive. Trust is efficient. The man who figured that out at 34 might have some regrets about the time he spent on the more expensive approach." "Some. Not enough to undo it. The expensive approach is the reason these walls are standing, and the garrison is loyal, and Lord Blackwood respects me enough to ride 12 hours through a winter storm. The fear built the foundation. What comes next builds on top of it. I don't get to have one without the other." "No, you don't. Nobody does. The parts of yourself you're least proud of are the same parts that kept you alive long enough to become someone better. You don't get to erase them. You just get to decide they're not the final version." He looked at her. The woman who had survived violence, exile, betrayal, and the systematic cruelty of a world that punished strength in women by calling it scandal. The woman who had ridden through frozen darkness to save a castle that wasn't hers, carrying evidence she had assembled from the wreckage of her own betrayal, converting pain into strategy and strategy into salvation with the fierce, relentless competence of someone who had learned that the world would not save her and had decided to save herself instead. And in saving herself, had saved him. Not from the siege, not from Malgrim, from the slow, invisible death of becoming his father, a man of immense power and absolute isolation, surrounded by systems that obeyed him, and not a single person who reached him. Caedric leaned back in his chair. The fire burned. The book lay open in Seraphina's lap. The castle was quiet around them. Stone and iron and 300 years of history settling into the night with the patience of structures that had survived everything the world had thrown at them and fully intended to survive whatever came next. He closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, from the specific, unprecedented experience of safety. The understanding that the room he was in, the woman beside him, and the life they were beginning to construct was not a temporary arrangement, but a foundation. Imperfect, untested, built from materials that no Draven had ever used, and held together by forces that no Draven had ever trusted. but standing. And for the first time in the history of Blackmere Keep, the man in the chair beside the fire was not sitting alone in the dark, calculating how to maintain power. He was sitting in the warmth, beside someone who had earned the right to stay, learning the harder and infinitely more valuable skill of deserving the life he had fought to build. Outside, the frozen sea caught the first light of distant stars. The winter was breaking. The kingdom was healing, and inside the walls of the most feared fortress in Valadorn, two people who had been taught by different forms of cruelty that love was a liability sat together in the firelight and proved, through the simple act of remaining, that it was the only asset that mattered. The Draven wolf still flew from Blackmere's towers. The banners still ruled the northern sky. But the man beneath them had changed, and the kingdom, whether it understood or not, had changed with him. Not because he conquered it, because he finally stopped conquering long enough to build something worth keeping.